The sea never revealed its secrets willingly. What we carried back from it were fragments, distorted frames, recordings that stretched the truth of scale. Fishermen once spoke of shadows larger than their vessels, but when the cameras caught those shadows too, the stories felt heavier. Grainy reels showed limbs brushing floodlights, eyes reflecting back through silt, and outlines so vast they eclipsed the surface above. Many said these were tricks of current or failures of the lens, yet others whispered that the ocean had allowed a glimpse of something real. And before we drift further, let me ask you to pause. Tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. Let's see how far these mysteries travel, from trench to tide pool, from your room to the bottom of the sea. Because tonight, what surfaces in this story is not only fish or whale, it is mass, presence, events moving under their own laws, and once caught on camera, they refuse to be forgotten. The ocean is never truly silent. Even on the stillest nights, when the sails hang limp and the stars scatter across the surface, like coins cast upon black glass, there is always something waiting in the deep. Sailors have spoken of it for centuries, not in the loud boasts of taverns, but in the hushed tones of those who know the sea carries memory. They tell of shapes surfacing in the calm, of glimmers that bend the water into patterns, too deliberate for chance, of shadows that linger not to strike, but simply to be known. And it is in these stories, half whispered and half forgotten, that the first visions rise. Imagine standing at the rail of a vessel, adrift in such stillness. The lantern at your side casts a glow no farther than the curve of the bow, and every ripple feels as though it is listening back. At first, the sea seems plain, a dark mirror of sky, but then, far below, a faint shimmer stirs. It is not the flicker of fish, nor the scatter of plankton, but a light too steady, too patient. Slowly it grows, widening into a line, then bending into an arc, until the keel rests above a curve glowing soft and pale. The men lean forward, their breaths caught, as another arc rises beside the first, then another. The water blooms with them, arcs overlapping, circling, forming the suggestion of a body too immense to see whole. No head breaks the surface, no tail strikes the waves, yet the pattern is unmistakable. Something vast has chosen to trace its outline in light alone. The arcs pulse faintly, fading and brightening, and with each rhythm, the sailors feel their own chests rise and fall, as though they have been folded into the breathing of another world. Minutes pass, though they feel like hours. No sound rises, no strike comes. The arcs hold steady, surrounding the ship in a ring that glows like the ribs of a lantern lifted in the dark. Then, as silently as it formed, the glow thins, one arc dissolves, then another, until the sea lies plain once more, its surface broken only by the faint slap of wood against wave. The men step back, their hands tight on the rails, their silence heavier than fear, for they know what they have seen is no trick of current, nor moon. It is presence. Later, when words return, they speak of it carefully. Some call it the first breathing, others the circle of light, but all agree on one truth, that the sea had revealed itself not as emptiness, but as body, and in that body, they glimpse something greater than storm or tide. Patience vast enough to rise, surround and then vanish without trace, leaving only memory burning in the eyes of those who dared to watch. The circle of light had vanished, yet the sailors remained at the rails long after, their hands white upon the wood. It was not fear that held them so still, but awe, an awe, sharpened by the knowledge that the sea had chosen to reveal itself, and then withdraw, as though testing whether they were ready to see more. And the ocean, vast and restless, never waits long to speak again. The next night began quietly. The lanterns swayed in faint wind, their glow stretching steady across calm water. The sky was clear, stars mirrored sharp and whole in the sea below, when the surface began to tremble. At first it seemed nothing more than current, a ripple in the distance. But then the ripples lengthened, bending into arcs, arcs folding into spirals, until the ship drifted within the widening mouth of a whirlpool. The sailors clutched the rails, but the vortex did not drag them down. Its pull was steady, measured, more like the drawing of breath than the violence of tide. The water glowed faintly along its ridges, each line pulsing as though veins carried light through the spiral's body. The vessel rocked gently at its center, balanced upon the edge of something that seemed less trap than heartbeat. For long minutes, perhaps hours, the whirl held them. The arcs widened, narrowed, widened again, each movement precise, patient, as though the ocean were showing them its measure. Some men whispered that they had been pulled into the chest of a giant, others that they had drifted into the pupil of an eye. Whatever its truth, none doubted they were enclosed within a rhythm too vast for them to resist. And then, just as it had opened, the spiral closed. The arc straightened, the glow dimmed, and the sea lay blank once more. The ship rocked free, lantern light spreading across ordinary water, the stars burning steady above. The sailors exhaled in unison, their breaths shallow, their voices hushed, for they knew they had not been trapped, but measured. Later they called it the Spiral One. Not beast, not leviathan, but presence, calm, deliberate, endless. And though it had vanished, each man carried away the certainty that the sea did not need storm to bind them. It could draw its circles around them at will, holding them in silence until it chose to let them go. The Spiral One had loosed its grip, leaving the sea smooth as though nothing had passed. Yet the men moved about the deck with the caution of those who had been held. They whispered little, their silence stretching long, for they knew the ocean could draw its circles again whenever it pleased. That night, as lanterns flickered in the still air, the sea revealed another of its shapes, one that rose not as coil nor arc, but as light blooming like breath. It began beneath the keel, a faint shimmer soft as dawn. The glow widened slowly, spreading outward in rings that pulsed with calm rhythm. Each circle brightened, then dimmed, then brightened again, as though the sea had found its own heartbeat. At first the sailors thought the glow would fade, yet it thickened instead, until the vessel floated within a field of living halos. Some rings stretched no wider than the deck itself, others spanned far enough to touch the horizon. The men clutched the rails, their breaths shallow, for the rings did not drift away. They grew and faded, their rhythm steady, their silence absolute. The sailors felt their own chests rise and fall in time with the pulses, as though they had been folded into the breathing of something too vast to name. The lanterns seemed dim beside the glow, and the stars overhead paled as though bowing before the light rising from below. For long minutes the ship rocked in that rhythm, every plank and rope answering to the measure. Some sailors bowed their heads, whispering prayers into the hush. Others stared outward, unwilling to blink, fearful the glow might vanish before they understood its meaning. No body broke the surface, no eyes gazed back, yet the presence was undeniable. The sea had turned itself into a field of breath, patient and deliberate, surrounding the vessel in its endless rhythm. At last the glow thinned. One ring dimmed, then another, until the circles dissolved into black water. The ship rocked free, lantern light reaching once more across ordinary waves. The stars returned to their mirrors upon the sea, and the silence lifted. The men exhaled together, their relief sharp, though none dared to laugh. Later they spoke of it as the breathing one. Not beast, not leviathan, but rhythm itself, life vast enough to rise beneath them without ever showing its form. And though it had vanished, each man carried away the certainty that the sea was not still, not ever. It was always breathing, patient as tide, and they had only glimpsed the moment when that breath reached the surface to remind them of its endlessness. The breathing one had slipped back into silence, but the men still felt the rhythm in their chests, as though their own hearts had been borrowed for a time by something deeper. They moved carefully about the deck, each step measured, their eyes fixed on the water with the unease of those who knew the ocean's calm was only another mask. And when the sea stirred again, it showed them not breath, not circles, but form, shapes rising so near the hull that the wood itself seemed to tremble. It began in darkness, when the sails hung slack and the air was still. The lanterns burned low, their glow faint, when the ship shifted. A tremor ran the length of its keel, followed by a slow lift as though something pressed upward from beneath. Then a pale ridge broke the surface. It was broad, glimmering faintly, etched with long grooves that stretched farther than sight. The men leaned over, breath caught, as another ridge rose, then another, until the vessel drifted upon arcs that curved in patient sequence. The arcs glowed softly, their lines pulsing in rhythm, as if veins carried light through their breadth. The ship rocked gently upon them, each rise and fall measured, unhurried, immense. Some sailors pressed their palms to the planks, swearing they felt the hum of something alive beneath. Others gripped the rails, staring outward as the arcs circled, realizing the vessel was not upon tide, but upon the body of something too vast to reveal itself whole. The ridges rolled for hours, steady, deliberate, enclosing the ship within a procession of living hills. The sailors whispered prayers, their voices faint, certain that they had entered the orbit of a being that did not need to strike to remind them of scale. No head appeared, no tail broke the waves, only arcs rising, falling, glowing, patient as the turn of seasons. Then, as slowly as they had come, the ridges sank. One by one they faded into the deep, their glow dimming until the sea lay plain once more. The lanterns brightened, their reach spreading, and the ship rocked free. Yet the men did not move at once. They stood at the rails, eyes fixed on the dark, their silence carrying the weight of having drifted upon shoulders too vast for words. Later they spoke of it as the procession, not beast, not apparition, but body shown in fragments, enough to remind them that they were not upon emptiness but upon the living back of the world itself. And though the ridges had gone, each sailor carried away the certainty that they had only crossed a small part of it, and that beneath the rest still waited, patient as stone, ready to rise again when it chose. The procession had vanished, its ridges sinking into black water, as if swallowed by silence, yet the men still felt as though their ship rocked upon a living back. Each glance toward the horizon carried unease, for they knew the sea had shown them only fragments, and the ocean, restless and vast, never lingers long on one form. On the following night, when the lanterns swayed in faint wind and the stars burned sharp above, another vision began to rise, not arcs, not ridges, but pillars drawn from the deep. It started with faint glimmers, rising like sparks caught in water. The sparks lengthened into lines, pale and straight, climbing until they reached the surface. One by one they stood, tall and narrow, circling the vessel in solemn patience. Their glow was soft, steady, as though each contained a breath of moonlight pressed into glass. The ship drifted at the center of their ring, sails slack though no wind faltered. The sailors gripped the rails, their silence deep as the columns swayed, not with tide, not with wave, but with rhythm, bending inward as though acknowledging the vessel caught within. Their glow pulsed faintly, each brightening, dimming, brightening again, and the men felt the rhythm in their bones. No sound carried, no mouth broke the sea, yet the weight of presence pressed upon them like unseen hands. For hours the ship remained enclosed, gliding forward through a corridor of living light. Some bowed their heads, whispering prayers into the hush. Others stood unblinking, unwilling to break the gaze of forms that seemed less beast than architecture, pillars of a cathedral raised not by stone, but by the will of water itself. The lanterns paled in comparison, their flames small, their reach insignificant, beside the ocean's glowing hall. At last the columns began to sink. One by one they dimmed, folding back into the dark until nothing remained but black water stretching wide. The lanterns brightened again, their glow reaching once more across the waves, and the ship rocked free. The men exhaled together, some with relief, others with sorrow, for they felt they had stepped out of a place too sacred for them to enter. Later they spoke of it as the colonnade, not beast, not leviathan, but structure, an architecture of the sea raised in silence for no witness, save those it chose to enclose. And though it had vanished, each sailor carried the conviction that it still waited below, patient, ready to rise again, when the ocean desired to remind them that it could build not only waves, but walls vast enough to turn the night into a temple. The colonnade had sunk into the dark, leaving the sailors hushed as though they had stepped from a hall not meant for their feet. They did not laugh, nor boast, nor even argue in whispers. Instead, they moved as men do, after prayer, measured, subdued, heavy with memory. But the ocean, vast and tireless, did not let silence endure for long. The next unveiling began not with glow nor swell, but with stillness so complete that the men knew at once it was no ordinary calm. The sails hung slack, the lanterns steady, and the sea lay flat, as if carved from stone. Then, from beneath, the lantern light faltered. It did not flicker, but bent, pulled inward toward a point just beyond the bow. The men leaned forward, hearts pounding, as the glow collapsed into a single line. That line brightened, stretched, and curved, until it circled the ship in a pale ring. Another ring followed, then another, until the vessel floated at the center of widening halos. The sailors gripped the rails, their silence heavy. The rings did not drift away, nor break into ripples. They held steady, glowing faintly, pulsing in rhythm. With each pulse the men felt their own breaths shorten, their chests tighten, as though the sea itself had reached upward to claim the measure of their lungs. For long minutes the halos swelled and shrank, marking time too vast for men to name. Then the glow began to fade. One ring thinned, then another, until only black water stretched around them. The lanterns brightened again, their reach restored, and the stars resumed their mirrors upon the waves. The ship rocked free, as though loosed from a hand that had held it gently but firmly. Later they spoke of it as the circles, not beast, not apparition, but presence patient enough to fold them into its rhythm, and then release them. And though the circles had dissolved, each man carried the weight of having been measured, certain that the sea had looked upon them in silence, and counted them among its endless breath. The circles had released them, fading as quietly as they had formed, yet the sailors could not shake the feeling that they had been weighed, like grains upon a scale too vast to read. They worked with hushed care, hands steady on rope and timber, their eyes drawn often to the black water, wary of what shape it might choose to wear next. And when the sea revealed itself again, it did so not with light nor arcs, but with shadow, an absence so complete that it seemed to steal the stars themselves. The night was clear, the heavens sharp and countless, when the first dimming began. At the edge of the horizon, a cluster of stars blinked out, one by one, as though a hand had passed across them. The men lifted their eyes, expecting cloud, but the sky remained unbroken above. It was the sea below that had taken them, swallowing their reflections and replacing them with nothing. Slowly the absence widened, a circle of black so deep it seemed cut into the water itself. The lanterns cast their glow toward it, but the light stopped short, pressed flat against its edge. Within the circle no reflection stirred, no ripple broke. It was not water as they knew it, but a hollow, a disk of void, where even the sea seemed unwilling to exist. The ship drifted closer, its timbers creaking in protest, as though the wood itself recognized the strangeness of what lay beneath. Then faintly, from the edges of the hollow, glimmers stirred. They gathered into arcs, arranging themselves into the outline of a face vast enough to hold the vessel within its gaze. No eyes shone, no mouth opened, yet the form was undeniable. It stared upward, features drawn not of light, but of absence, as though the sea had carved itself into a mask of void. The sailors clutched the rails, their breaths shallow. No motion broke the water, no strike threatened the hull, yet the weight of being seen pressed heavier than storm. Some bowed their heads, others stared unblinking, hearts thundering against the silence. The face lingered for long minutes, unchanging, before unraveling into scattered sparks. The hollow closed, the reflections returned, and the sea lay calm once more. Later they called it the face of absence. Not beast, not leviathan, but a reminder that the sea could take shape even in nothingness, revealing its will in silence alone. And though it had dissolved, each man carried the certainty that somewhere beneath, the void still lingered, patient, waiting to rise again, when the ocean chose to remind them that its gaze required neither eyes nor flesh. The face of absence dissolved back into the dark, but the men did not move easily afterward. Their hands lingered on the rails, their eyes scanning the water, as though the void might open again at any moment. Even when ordinary waves lapped softly against the hull, no comfort came. For they knew now the sea could strip itself of all substance, wearing emptiness as its mask. Yet the ocean does not linger long on one guise. When it rose again, it did so with movement, so immense and so deliberate, that every man aboard felt his footing stolen by awe. The night was clear, the air soft, the sails hanging loose when the keel shuddered. At first it was faint, a tremor like distant thunder rolling beneath the timbers. Then the water ahead lifted, not sharply, but in a long, smooth rise. A ridge broke the surface, pale against the black, glowing faintly with lines that pulsed as though carrying fire through veins. Another ridge followed, then another, spreading outward, until the ship floated upon a series of rolling arcs. The arcs moved slowly, steady as the turning of seasons. They circled the vessel, enclosing it in a ring of rising and falling hills. The sailors clutched the rails, some whispering prayers, others staring unblinking, for the arcs stretched farther than their eyes could follow. No head appeared, no eye opened, yet the rhythm pressed upon them with certainty. They were riding upon the back of something alive, something greater than any land they had known. For hours the arcs rolled, carrying the ship as though upon the shoulders of a patient giant. The glow waxed and waned, brightening along the ridges, dimming in the troughs, until the men felt their own breaths, matching its rhythm. The ship rocked gently, each rise and fall a reminder of scale, each glow a reminder of life vast enough to remain unseen. At last the arcs sank. One by one they slipped beneath the surface, their glow thinning until only black water stretched wide. The ship rocked free, sails catching faint wind, and the stars returned to their mirrors upon the sea. The men exhaled together, their relief quiet, their awe heavy. Later they named it the Rolling One, not beast, not leviathan, but presence, a body too vast to show itself whole, choosing instead to raise only the curves of its breath. And though it had gone, each sailor carried the conviction that they had crossed not upon water, but upon flesh. That beneath every voyage, hidden in silence, the back of the world still waited, patient, ready to rise again. The Rolling One had sunk, its arcs dissolving into black water, yet the men still felt as though they were moving upon its back. Every groan of timber, every sigh of rope, seemed to echo the rhythm of those vast ridges. They worked in silence, their eyes often drawn to the horizon, fearful and yearning for the sea to show itself again. When it did, the revelation came not with arcs, nor ridges, but with columns rising so quietly that, at first, they thought them tricks of lantern light. The surface trembled, faint ripples, spreading in every direction. Then pale shafts rose from the deep, straight and narrow, circling the vessel in solemn measure. Their glow was soft, not fierce, but steady, like moonlight captured and pressed into stone. One by one they surrounded the ship, until it drifted at the heart of a ring that swayed with slow, deliberate rhythm. The sailors clutched the rails, the columns bent inward, as though acknowledging the vessel they enclosed. Their glow pulsed faintly, brightening and dimming, until the ship seemed caught within the breathing of a cathedral, not built by human hands. The air grew heavy with stillness, the men's breaths shallow, as though the ocean had demanded silence within its hall. For long minutes the ship drifted through that living colonnade. Some sailors bowed their heads, unwilling to look up into the faintly glowing arches overhead. Others stood frozen, their eyes wide, unwilling to blink, lest the vision dissolve. No beast revealed itself, no mouth opened, yet the presence pressed upon them heavier than storm. They knew they were within a structure vast enough to contain their ship like dust upon its floor. At last the glow began to fade. The columns sank one by one, dimming until they slipped beneath the surface, leaving the ship adrift once more. The lanterns brightened again, their reach stretching far across the waves, and the night resumed its silence. But none aboard believed the colonnade was gone. They felt it waiting, deep below, its pillars folded in patience. Later they called it the Hall of the Sea, not beast, not apparition, but architecture raised for reasons beyond men's knowing. Some said it had been built as a passage, others as a warning, but all agreed it was not chance, it was choice. And though the sea had let them go, each sailor carried the conviction that one day the columns would rise again, and the ocean would draw its arches overhead to remind them that its silence could build walls as easily as waves. The hall of the sea had vanished into darkness, yet the men still felt themselves walking beneath its arches long after. They moved softly upon the deck, their steps careful, as though they were afraid to break the hush the ocean had pressed upon them. Some sailors kept their eyes to the horizon, others dared not look at all, yet all shared the same unease, that the sea would raise its pillars again without warning. But when it revealed itself next, it was not with columns nor ridges. It came as reflection bent into a shape too vast to mistake. The night was calm, the stars sharp, their light mirrored clean upon the still surface. For a time the sailors found comfort in the symmetry, believing themselves carried upon a second sky. But then the reflection began to warp, stars bent inward, spiraling toward a single point just beneath the bow. Constellations stretched, lines curved, until the mirrored heavens folded themselves into a face. It was vast, larger than the ship, its features drawn not by light, but by absence. A brow arched across the water, eyes opened where stars had vanished, a mouth curved from darkness alone. The sailors froze, their breath caught, for it gazed upward with such patience that it seemed to measure them without motion. No sound came, no swell stirred the hull, yet the weight of its regard pressed upon them heavier than storm. Some men bowed their heads, unable to meet the gaze. Others stared on, hearts pounding, unwilling to look away. The mask of the sea lingered, its vast outline unblinking, until even the lantern flames seemed to falter in its presence. Then, as slowly as it had formed, it began to dissolve. The mouth unraveled into scattered ripples, the eyes faded back into stars, and the sea smoothed to plain reflection once more. The sailors exhaled in unison, some whispering prayers, others gripping the rails, as though the wood might anchor them against memory. They knew they had not seen trick nor dream. They had seen the sea borrow the sky, shaping its stars into a visage that looked back at those who dared to look down. Later they called it the mirror's mask, not beast, not leviathan, but the sea itself choosing to wear the heavens as its face. And though the mask had vanished, each man carried the certainty that every reflection upon the water was only surface. At any moment, with no warning at all, it could bend again, open into features vast and patient, and remind them that the ocean was never merely a mirror, but a watcher waiting to return its gaze. The mirror's mask had folded itself back into the stars, yet the men could not unsee the face that had gazed up at them from reflection. Their hands trembled long after, and each time they glanced at the water, they feared the heavens might bend once more into eyes. Still, the voyage pressed onward, the horizon steady, the air soft, until another night, when the ocean chose to show a shape not of stars, nor arches, nor ridges, but of light rising like lanterns from the deep. It began with faint glimmers beneath the keel. At first they seemed no more than sparks, drifting upward as though stirred by invisible fire. But then they grew larger, round and pale, until the ship floated amid a rising field of orbs. They hovered just below the surface, some small as lantern flames, others so vast they seemed to stretch wider than the deck. Each pulsed softly, brightening and dimming in rhythm, their glow reflected upon the sailors' faces. The men gripped the rails, hushed. The orbs did not scatter nor fade, but arranged themselves into a procession that drifted alongside the ship. Some pressed close, brushing the water near the hull, their glow bathing the wood in pale shimmer. Others lingered farther out, their outlines faint, as though watching from distance. All moved together, their rhythm steady, patient, unhurried. For hours the vessel drifted within their company. The sailors felt their own heartbeats slow, their breaths drawn into the same rhythm as the glowing spheres. Lanterns seemed weak beside them, and the stars overhead looked dim, as though bowing before the greater light below. Some men whispered prayers, others only stared, unwilling to break the silence that seemed part of the vision itself. Then, as dawn touched the horizon, the orbs began to sink. One by one they slipped into darkness, their glow thinning until only ordinary water remained. The lanterns regained their reach, the sky brightened, and the ship rocked free upon the morning tide. Yet none aboard felt it was over. They knew the orbs had not vanished, only drifted back into the deep, waiting with patience older than men. Later they called it the Field of Moons, not beast, not apparition, but a gathering of light vast enough to surround a ship and fold it into its rhythm. And though the spheres had gone, each sailor carried away the certainty that they had looked upon a company too immense for charts, too deliberate for chance, and that somewhere beneath it still glowed in silence, waiting to rise again. The Field of Moons had faded into the depths, but its glow lingered in the sailors' eyes. They moved softly about the deck, careful with each rope and step, as though fearful of disturbing what still shimmered unseen below. For nights the sea held calm, giving no hint of what form it might raise next. But the ocean is never empty, only patient. And when it stirred again, it revealed a vision unlike any before, an unveiling of walls so vast that the ship seemed no more than dust drifting through corridors of silence. It began with the water tightening around the keel, thickening into a surface too smooth to be ordinary. Lantern light spread outward, then bent, pulled inward, as though caught between unseen hands. Slowly, faint ridges rose, pale and tall, rising straight as pillars. More followed, stretching in pairs, until the ship floated between them as though entering a gate. The sailors gripped the rails, their breath sharp, as the ridges pulsed faintly within a glow, veins of light running through their breadth, like hidden fire. The vessel drifted onward, carried not by wind but by stillness, deeper into a passage that arched overhead. The columns swayed, bending inward, as though watching, their glow brightening and dimming in rhythm too measured to be chance. The men whispered no words, their silence heavier than fear, for they knew they had entered a place not meant for them, a hall raised from the body of the sea itself. For long minutes the ship glided through that glowing corridor. Some sailors bowed their heads, unwilling to raise their eyes beneath its vast arches. Others stared unblinking, caught between terror and reverence, certain they had drifted into a temple vast enough to hold the world. No beast revealed itself, no strike came, yet the presence pressed upon them with such weight that even their hearts seemed to beat slower, folded into the patience of the sea's design. At last the glow thinned, one by one the pillars sank, their light fading, their forms dissolving into black water. The arches vanished, the stars returned to their mirrors above, and the ship rocked free upon ordinary tide. The men exhaled in unison, their breath shallow, their eyes wide, their silence unbroken. Later they spoke of it as the drowned cathedral, not beast, not leviathan, but architecture vast enough to contain them without effort, raised not for men but for the sea itself. And though the pillars had sunk, each sailor carried the certainty that the hall was not gone. It had only closed its doors, waiting in the dark, patient as tide, until the ocean chose again to draw its walls from silence, and remind them that they sailed upon a world capable of building its own temples. The drowned cathedral had slipped back into the deep, yet the memory of its arches clung to the men like mist in their lungs. They moved about the deck, as though walking within it still, careful, subdued, their eyes lowered against a weight they could not name. Nights passed quietly, but they had learned the lesson of silence. Calm was not absence, only waiting, and when the ocean stirred again, it revealed not arches nor ridges, but movement so vast that the sea itself seemed to lift and breathe beneath their feet. The first sign was a tremor, subtle at first, running like a sigh through the keel. It grew until the lanterns swayed in unison. Then the ship lifted, not sharply, but smoothly, as though borne upon a chest too immense to see whole. The water bulged outward, pale arcs rising and falling in slow succession, each ridge glowing faintly with veins of hidden fire. The sailors leaned over the rails, their throats tight, for the arcs circled the vessel, enclosing it within a ring of endless motion. For hours the ship was carried upon those ridges. They rolled steadily, their rhythm deliberate, patient, vast. Some men whispered prayers into the hush, their voices swallowed by the glow. Others stared unblinking, unable to look away, for the arcs pulsed in a rhythm that drew their hearts into its measure. It was not storm nor tide, not hunger nor threat, but presence, life immense enough to bear them without notice, patience vast enough to encircle them without strike. At last the arcs sank, fading into the deep, the glow dissolving until the sea lay blank once more. The lanterns brightened, their glow restored, and the stars resumed their mirrors above. Yet none aboard felt released. They knew they had been carried upon a body too great for their minds to hold, shown only its breadth, its shoulders, its patience. Later they spoke of it as the Endless One, not beast, not leviathan, but a reminder that the ocean itself was living spine and rib, capable of rising beneath them without need to show its face. And though it had sunk, each sailor carried the certainty that it had not gone far. It waited, coiled in silence, patient as tide, ready to lift them again when it chose. The Endless One had faded, but its rhythm still beat within their ribs. The sailors worked softly, as though unwilling to disturb the silence left behind. Yet the sea is never still. It does not rest, it only waits. And when it rose again, it revealed itself not in ridges, not in arches, but in reflection bent into a shape more haunting than flesh. The night was calm, the stars sharp, their light mirrored perfectly upon the sea. For a time the sailors found comfort in the symmetry, believing themselves cradled between two heavens. But then the reflection trembled. Stars bent inward, spiraling toward the keel, lines warped, constellations folded, until the mirrored sky shaped itself into a visage vast and patient. A brow arched across the surface, eyes opened where stars had vanished, a mouth curved from darkness alone. The sailors froze, no sound rose, no wave stirred, yet the mask gazed upward as though measuring each man upon the deck. Some bowed their heads, unable to endure its weight. Others stared wide-eyed, their hearts hammering, unwilling to look away. The face did not change, did not move, yet its stillness pressed upon them heavier than any storm. The lantern flames dimmed beside its gaze, their light swallowed by the dark outline. For long minutes the mask lingered, its features unbroken, patient, unblinking. Then slowly, the stars returned to their places. The mouth dissolved into ripples, the eyes thinned into points of light, and the sea smoothed once more into a perfect mirror. The men exhaled, some in prayer, some in silence. They knew they had not seen trick nor dream. They had seen the ocean bend the sky, shaping its constellations into a face that looked back. Later they called it the Watcher, not beast, not leviathan, but presence, the sea borrowing the heavens to wear as its mask. And though it had gone, each sailor carried the certainty that every reflection upon the water was alive, waiting to bend again, waiting to open into eyes, when the ocean wished to remind them that no gaze upon its surface was ever one-sided. The Watcher dissolved, returning the stars to their rightful places. But the men did not forget. Every time they looked over the rails into the mirrored sea, they feared the mask might reform, its gaze, patient, unblinking. Yet the ocean never repeats itself exactly. When it chose to rise again, it was not with a face, nor with ridges, but with silence turned into shape. The night was cloudless, the air mild. When the ship slowed, the sails sagged, the lantern flames burned steady, but the vessel drifted as though caught upon unseen ground. Then the water ahead darkened, not cloud, not current, but absence, as though the sea itself had been hollowed. Slowly from that hollow pale forms emerged, arches, towers, walls, outlined faintly with glow. The sailors stared wide-eyed as the ship slipped into a city built of silence. The structures rose on either side, bridges spanning above, columns etched with faint veins of light. They were not stone, not flesh, but outlines, as though the ocean had chosen to remember something long buried. The vessel drifted through streets of light. The sailors hushed, their breaths shallow. Some whispered prayers, others pressed their hands to the rails, unwilling to believe their eyes. For long minutes, perhaps hours, they sailed through that drowned city. No voices rose, no current stirred, yet the presence pressed upon them with weight older than land. The glow pulsed faintly, steady as breath, until at last the outlines dimmed. One by one the arches fell back into darkness, The walls dissolved into ripples, and the city vanished, as though it had never been. The sailors exhaled in unison, their silence unbroken. Later they spoke of it cautiously, calling it the memory of stone. Not beast, not leviathan, but remembrance, shapes of places too ancient for men to know, raised upon the sea's skin for a night, and then swallowed again. And though it had vanished, each sailor carried the conviction that the city still lingered below, waiting with patience older than tide, ready to rise again when the ocean chose to show its memory once more. There were seas where no chart offered guidance, stretches of water so vast and still that even the most seasoned sailors grew uneasy. They called them the hushed depths, where sound seemed swallowed whole, and the horizon stood empty for days. It was in such places that the ocean guarded its oldest secrets, and it was there that one crew found themselves adrift, when the sea revealed what lay beneath. The night was calm, the lantern steady, when the ship began to lift. No storm swelled the waves, no wind stirred the sails, yet the water pressed upward, carrying the vessel upon a rise too broad to be tied. Slowly a ridge surfaced, glimmering pale against the dark, etched with grooves that pulsed faintly, as though filled with hidden fire. The men leaned over the rails, their breath shallow, for the ridge did not belong to any whale or serpent spoken of before. The arc was immense, stretching wider than sight, its grooves glowing faint as veins of light across stone. The ship rocked upon its curve, the timbers creaking under the weight of a presence too vast to reveal itself whole. Then another ridge followed, rolling in silence, circling the vessel with patient rhythm. The sailors whispered no words, their silence heavier than fear, for they knew they were not caught in current, but in the breathing of something alive. For long minutes the ridges held them, their glow pulsing in rhythm, each swell lifting the ship, as though it were no more than driftwood, upon the chest of a giant. Then, as quietly as it had risen, the body sank, the water smoothed, the lanterns brightened, and the vessel rocked free. Yet none aboard felt released. Later they spoke of it only as the reminder, not beast, not leviathan, but presence, a fragment of life vast enough to bend the ocean without rising whole. And though it had gone, each man carried the certainty that they had drifted upon more than water. They had crossed the surface of something patient, endless, and unwilling to be forgotten. Farther along that coast, another encounter deepened the unease. The sky was clear, the sea plain, when a sound trembled through the timbers. It was not the groan of wood, nor the whisper of tide, but a sigh, long and low, drawn through the water, as though the ocean itself exhaled. The sailors stilled, their hands tight upon rope and rail, listening as the sound thickened, spreading through the hull like breath through bone. Then the water darkened. From below a shape moved, vast enough to blot lantern glow, its skin patterned with rings of light. Each circle shimmered faintly, then dimmed, only for the next to brighten, pulsing in sequence along its length. They ran from bow to stern, vanishing into darkness, their rhythm so steady it seemed less motion than heartbeat. The ship rocked upon its passage, the planks humming as though answering to its breath. No eye appeared, no mouth broke the waves, yet the men felt themselves measured, their hearts drawn into the same cadence as the glowing rings. Hours passed after it vanished, but the ship drifted still upon a current that pulsed in the same rhythm, as though the sea itself carried memory of its passing. None aboard spoke of it as beast. They said it moved with patience, not hunger, with rhythm, not violence. It was something older than maps, older than men, circling the waters long before sails had touched horizon. Later they called it the Sighing One, a presence that announced itself not with roar nor strike, but with breath vast enough to fold a ship into silence. In time, another voyage told of a sight stranger still. The men thought they had come upon a new island, its shape rising broad and dark against the horizon, the decks filled with shouts, charts drawn, compasses set. But as they drew nearer, the island shifted. What they had taken for hills began to roll, one after the other, vertebrae breaking the surface as though a chain of mountains had stirred awake. Each ridge gleamed slick with salt, shining pale in lantern light, and upon their backs clung gardens of weed and shell. Whole patches of kelp swayed like forests, barnacles crusted thick as villages, starfish spread like mosaics. The sailors stared in awe, whispering that the creature carried not only its own body, but pieces of the sea itself, as though it bore an entire country upon its spine. The ridges stretched farther than sight, curving into horizon, their line unbroken. The ship drifted along its breadth for hours. The men hushed, their voices lost beneath the weight of scale. Some claimed they smelled earth upon the air, damp and fertile, as though they truly floated past land. Yet no shore followed, no beach appeared, only the endless roll of vertebrae rising, falling, steady, unhurried. At last the creature sank. Its ridges slipped beneath the waves, the gardens of weed vanishing with them, until the sea lay plain again. The ship rocked free, but the men did not rejoice. They knew they had crossed no island, but a body vast enough to wear the sea as garment. Later they spoke of it as the living isle. Not beast, not apparition, but country of flesh, patient enough to rise and rest beneath the stars. And though it had gone, each man swore that whenever he set foot on land again, he could not help but remember the day he had walked upon earth while floating over the back of something alive. There were also stories of watchers, shapes that rose not to strike, nor to breathe, but only to look. One night, when the sea lay flat as glass, the men aboard a quiet vessel felt it stir. No current shifted, no wind moved, yet from below rose a single eye. It surfaced beside the hull without ripple, wide as the deck, glassy and pale. Its glow was faint, a blue so cold it seemed born of starlight pressed through deep water. The sailors froze where they stood, every hand still, every breath caught, for the eye floated level with the deck, its gaze unbroken. It blinked once, slowly, not in alarm nor threat, but in patience, as though studying them. Minutes stretched into silence. The men felt as though their thoughts themselves were being measured, their secrets drawn out by that steady gaze. Then, without sound, the eye sank. No splash marked its passing, only a thin trail of bubbles rising in its wake. For days after, the sailors claimed they still felt its watch upon them. Not their ship, but their very minds seemed followed, as though the sea itself had lent them a sentinel. Later they spoke of it only as the eye, not beast, not leviathan, but gaze alone, a presence that needed no body to remind men that they were never unwatched upon the water. And still the tales continued. Each was different in shape, yet all carried the same weight, presence vast enough to fold silence around a ship, until men could no longer tell whether they drifted on water or upon a body. One crew told of a night when the sea began to glow, not with scattered sparks of plankton, but with rolling arcs of light. The glow rose in bands, sweeping beneath the hull, in curves that brightened and dimmed with rhythm. Slowly they gathered into spiral, a coil unfurling from the deep, its edges casting green and silver upon the ship. The sailors gripped the rails, their silence heavy, for the spiral turned outward, as though the creature itself were wound like a coil of endless length. The glow thickened, brighter than lantern flame, brighter even than moonlight, until the vessel floated at the heart of its pattern. For minutes, perhaps hours, the spiral held, turning with patient precision. The sailors felt their hearts tighten, their breaths drawn into its rhythm, as though they had been folded into the very breath of the sea. Then, as silently as it had formed, the spiral unwound. The arcs dimmed, the glow thinned, and the water smoothed into darkness once more. The ship rocked gently, as if pushed by a hand too vast to see. Later they spoke of it as the coil, not beast, not leviathan, but reminder that the ocean could raise shapes of light, not to harm, but to be remembered. And though it had vanished, each man carried the conviction that the spiral was not gone. It waited, patient as tide, ready to rise again when the ocean wished to show its hidden patterns once more. The sea carried many moods, yet there were passages when it seemed to carry only one: watchfulness. The sailors described a night when the water grew so still that it felt less like an ocean and more like a pane of glass stretched beneath the hull. Then, gently the stillness broke. A glow stirred below, not the flicker of plankton, but a broad living light moving in a slow curve. It thickened until the whole expanse beneath the ship gleamed faint green, and within that glow swam a shape none could name. Its body seemed woven of long, twisting bands, layered as though formed from strands of kelp, yet each band moved with strength enough to shift the vessel sideways. The glow circled once, casting strange shadows upon the sails, before unwinding into the dark. The silence that followed held longer than before, as if the ocean were waiting for an answer the men could not give. Some whispered that the sea had been showing them a pattern, not a creature, though none could explain why the pattern had carried weight enough to rock the ship in its passing. Not long after, in another stretch of lonely water, the men felt the deck quiver beneath their feet, though no wind stirred and no tide rose. Slowly the surface lifted, parting into wide arcs that rolled outward. What rose was neither fin nor back, but something stranger. A crown of tall spines that jutted upward, each one glistening like wet iron. The spines swayed as though part of a single body, rising higher until they stood taller than the mast itself. The creature beneath never surfaced in full, only showed its jagged crown as it drifted beside them. Lanterns flickered, shadows danced across the deck, and for long minutes the men dared not breathe. Then the spines lowered, sinking one by one, until the sea lay smooth again. It was not the size alone that troubled them, but the way the spines had swayed together, not in chaos, but in rhythm, as if listening to some tide deeper than the one they knew. There were other nights, when the presence revealed itself only through eyes. The sailors recalled how the sea darkened suddenly, and then two orbs lifted from below, wide as shields and glowing faintly gold. They hovered just beneath the surface, casting a dim circle of light around the hull. The eyes blinked once, slowly, and for that moment, the entire crew felt as though they themselves were being measured, weighed by something older than any age they could name. The glow lasted long enough for men to grip the rails in silence, before the eyes sank again, leaving behind no sound but the creak of timbers. Yet many claimed afterward that even when the glow was gone, they still felt it upon them, a gaze that lingered in thought, if not in sight, and some said their dreams in the weeks that followed carried the same steady golden light, watching from beneath waves that never broke. Among the many strange sightings, one remains spoken of as the most haunting. The men described how the water around them began to pulse, rising and falling with a rhythm too slow for waves. Then the surface broke, not in a crash, but in a smooth lifting, as though a hidden dome pressed upward. From it emerged a back so broad that it seemed a piece of the sea floor had risen. Its skin was patterned with spirals, each spiral glowing faintly blue, spreading wider as the body shifted. The ship rocked gently as the spirals pulsed in time with the waters heaving. Then the creature sank without haste, the spirals dimming until only starlight remained. The sailors spoke afterward of a strange calm, not fear, not awe, but the sense that they had been shown a secret design of the sea, something not meant to be captured in word or ink, but remembered in silence. There were voyages when the sea left, not only a vision but a trace. One crew told of how the water suddenly grew warmer beneath them, and moments later a shape rolled just below, long and shimmering with streaks of silver. It passed without haste, brushing near enough that the hull quivered. When it vanished, the men leaned over the rails and saw the water glowing faintly in its wake, a line of light that stretched behind them like a path. That glow lasted through the night, trailing their vessel no matter how far it sailed. By morning it had faded, but the crew swore the air still held the same warmth, as though the creature had left behind a mark not on the sea, but on the very course of their voyage. To this day, those who tell the story say it was less an encounter than a guiding, the sea itself placing a hand upon the ship and steering it along. The sea had ways of changing without warning, and the men often said it could become a different world between one breath and the next. On one voyage, they spoke of a night so still that even the sails sagged with silence. Then the water darkened, not by cloud or storm, but as though a shadow had risen beneath it. Slowly the hull drifted upward, lifted by a body that never broke the surface in full. Instead, the sailors saw only ridges rising along its back, ridges that glowed faintly green, like moss catching hidden light. They stretched farther than the lantern beams could follow, rolling one by one before slipping down again. For hours after, the ship rocked gently, not with waves, but with the rhythm of something vast moving below. The crew spoke little, for no words seemed strong enough. Yet every man remembered the quiet that followed, as though the sea had chosen to rest alongside them. There were other nights when the sea seemed to breathe. The men described how currents pulled backward, dragging the ship in a slow circle, though no wind touched the sails. Then came a low sigh, so deep it shook the deck beneath their boots. From the water rose a crest, unlike any they had seen, smooth, gleaming, and marked with lines that glowed faint red, like veins carrying fire. The crest circled the ship once, moving with measured patience, and sank again, leaving the water curling behind it. The silence returned as before, though the men swore their hearts beat in time with the fading circles of current. In the morning, when the sun broke the horizon, they looked back and saw the sea still trembling, as if reluctant to close what it had shown. On a later journey, the ship drifted through waters so dark they seemed endless. Lanterns barely touched the waves, and it was then the men noticed a glow beneath. At first it seemed like scattered sparks of plankton, but the glow grew, forming the outline of a body greater than any they could measure. The shape was not smooth like a whale, nor jagged like rock, but layered as if its skin folded into itself. The folds shifted, bending the water as it moved, until the whole mass curved past like a moving cliff. It gave no sign of threat, no surge or strike, only the slow roll of its body before it disappeared into blackness. The men stood without speaking, each holding tight to the rails, for it felt less like they had seen a creature, and more like they had glimpsed a wall of the ocean itself pulling away. There were also times when the sea announced its visitor, not with light or form, but with sound that came from no storm. On one still night, the men heard a single thrum roll through the hull, low and deep, like a drum struck beneath the waves. It came again, stronger, and the lanterns shook in their hooks. The sailors looked over the side, but the water showed nothing save their own pale reflections. Then the sound grew steady, beating in rhythm, until the ship itself seemed to move with its pulse. Just as suddenly, the noise stopped, and the sea grew silent again. The crew held their breath, waiting for another strike, yet none came. When they told the story after, each man agreed on one thing: no current, no tremor, no wave had ever carried the sound of a heart. Yet that night the sea itself had one. The final memory of that long passage was the strangest of all. The night was clear, stars shining sharp across the sky, and the water reflected them so perfectly it seemed the ship sailed between two heavens. Then the reflection shifted. The stars bent, curving into lines that formed shapes no constellation carried. Slowly, the men saw the outline of a face drawn in the water, vast, featureless, yet impossible to mistake. Its eyes were not lit, yet they pressed upon the sailors all the same, holding them in place with a gaze older than speech. The image lingered, rippling gently, until it dissolved back into scattered starlight. The water smoothed as if nothing had stirred, but the men swore they still felt that gaze within them, a reminder that the sea was not empty, sky turned upside down, but a world of its own, and in that world eyes sometimes opened. The ocean often revealed its mysteries, not in storm or fury, but in stillness. On one crossing, the crew spoke of a night when the water stretched smooth as glass, the stars mirrored clear and unbroken. Then the sea shifted, not with wind, but as though something stirred far below, lifting the surface with care. Slowly a form emerged, not jagged nor finned, but a great dome, round and smooth, glistening as though polished by ages. The men at first thought they had drifted upon a hidden shoal, but the dome moved, circling the ship in silence. faint lines traced across its surface, glowing as if lit from within, pulsing in patterns like breath. It lingered long enough for them to count 3 full turns before it sank again, leaving the waters flat, as though nothing had stirred. They whispered afterward that it had not risen to threaten, but to remind them the sea carried its own quiet heart. Another telling spoke of a body long and sinuous, unlike serpent or eel, for its movements held no rush nor strike. It rose gently beside the ship, its coils lifting one by one, each thicker than the mast, each gleaming pale beneath lantern light. Seaweed clung to its skin, carried like a cloak, and small fish darted in and out, as if it bore with it its own world. The coils stretched so far that no man aboard saw its end. For long minutes it drifted there, its turning so slow that the waves it made were no higher than a sigh. When it slipped back into the depths, the water closed without ripple, but the memory of its length lingered like a dream that could not be measured. The sailors did not mark it as danger, but as a vision of age itself, alive and moving beneath them. There were accounts of creatures that carried light, not upon their eyes, nor scales, but deep within their flesh. One such encounter came on a journey where the seas were calm, and the men saw beneath them a glow rising slowly, like dawn beneath water. The light spread in long bands, twisting together as though woven, and within it moved a shape too vast to follow. It circled once, and the glow painted the underside of the ship in shifting patterns, spirals and arcs, that pulsed with a rhythm steady as a drumbeat. The sailors stood quiet, feeling as though the sea itself was speaking in light. Then, as gently as it had risen, the glow dimmed, each band fading until only the black water remained. Some swore afterward that when they closed their eyes, the patterns still pulsed before them, as though the sea had left its mark upon their sight. Another story told of a being so large that it carried what seemed to be an entire forest upon its back. The sailors first believed they had drifted toward land, for they saw what looked like trees swaying in the night wind. Yet as their lanterns shone across the water, they saw the truth. Each trunk was a spine, each swaying bough a tendril of flesh, rising from a body submerged. The forest shifted as the body moved, swaying together as though drawn by a single breath. For hours it drifted near, the ship rocking lightly with its passage, until at last the forest lowered into the deep, leaving the sea barren and bare once more. Men spoke of it afterward, not as terror but as wonder, for they felt they had walked to the edge of 2 worlds, one of land and one of ocean, and for a night the boundary between them had vanished. The sea, men said, held creatures that left more questions than fear. One telling speaks of a shape that surfaced like a ridge of hills. The water rolled back to reveal a broad flank, rough and weathered, yet moving with steady grace. Across its surface glimmered circles, faint and pale, that grew brighter when touched by lantern light. The circles expanded slowly, spreading outward as though the creature itself breathed light into the waves. Then, without haste, it sank again, the circles fading in its wake, until the sea lay black and still. The sailors swore the ship drifted smoother after, as though carried by an unseen hand, guided on by the presence they had witnessed. They told it not as a tale of peril, but as memory of the night when the sea itself seemed to bless their passage. There was a crossing when the sea seemed to breathe beneath the ship, slow and steady, as though some vast body lay sleeping just below. The sailors said the water lifted and fell not with tide nor wave, but with the rhythm of lungs drawing air. At first they thought it the trick of imagination, but then the surface swelled and a shape drifted near, so close the lanterns caught it glistening. Its skin was pale as worn marble, marked with lines that curved like veins beneath stone. It lingered without sound, the swells rocking the ship in calm rhythm, before it rolled to one side and slipped beneath again. For long minutes afterward the water continued to rise and fall, and the men stood hushed, each one feeling as though the sea itself had shared its breath with them, letting them glimpse the life that moved unseen in its depths. Another passage told of a presence that did not show its body first, but its shadow. The night was clear, stars bright above, when the water beneath darkened all at once, as if something immense had slid between the ship and the heavens, reflected on the sea. The sailors leaned over the rails, peering down, and saw the shadow moving slowly, stretching farther than the length of the vessel. Now and then a ridge broke the surface, smooth and gleaming like wet stone, before sinking again. The shadow drifted on, circling once before vanishing, and when it was gone, the reflections of stars returned. The men swore they had felt its gaze, even though no eyes were seen, as if the shadow itself had watched them before fading into the deep. There were times when the sea gave not shape nor sound, but light. On one journey, the sailors noticed a faint glow seeping up from the depths, first mistaken for lanterns, reflected on the water. Yet the glow grew brighter, until it formed rings spreading outward, one after the other, encircling the ship, as though it floated at the heart of a living beacon. The men held their breath as the rings pulsed in perfect rhythm, casting green and silver shadows upon the deck. Slowly the glow sank, the rings dimming as they fell into the dark, until the sea was black once more. None spoke for some time, for it seemed less an encounter with a creature than a message written in light, a language the ocean used to remind them how little they understood of its speech. The oldest hands often told of a giant unlike any known, one that never revealed its body in whole, but always in pieces, that suggested a size beyond reason. On one calm night, the sea rose at the stern, and a fin like a tower lifted from the dark. It gleamed slick, ridged with grooves that caught the lantern glow, then lowered with measured grace. Moments later, another surfaced, then another, each rising at a distance from the last, as though the creature stretched longer than any ship could ever follow. The men stood frozen, counting fins until they vanished into black water. No roar, no strike, no violence came, only the quiet roll of a being too vast to see entire. They said afterward the memory was heavier than terror, for terror fades, but awe clings. And there were nights when the sea itself seemed to carry eyes. Sailors spoke of a voyage when the water gleamed faintly with two pale lights, drifting slowly just below the surface. The orbs rose until they floated beside the ship, steady and unblinking, their glow faint as moonlight through cloud. They remained there for minutes, gazing upward, casting a soft circle of light across the planks. The men dared not move, for it felt as though each thought was being read, measured, and carried into the deep. Then the orbs dimmed, sinking without ripple, leaving behind only darkness. The crew said little after, but each man carried the same impression that it had not come to harm them, but to see them, to mark their passage, and then return to its hidden path below. There was a voyage remembered for how quietly it began, and how strangely it ended. The ship drifted for hours on a sea that lay so flat. The stars seemed doubled, shining above and below alike. The men were content, speaking in hushed voices, until the water beneath them stirred without warning. It rose not in waves, but in a single swell, smooth and deliberate, lifting the vessel as though upon a hidden back. Lantern light glimmered across a surface just beneath, pale and ridged like weathered stone. For long minutes the ship rode high, steady as if resting upon a platform. Then the swell eased away, lowering them with the same slow care, until the sea lay calm again. The sailors never saw a head, nor tail, nor fin, but each swore that the ocean itself had borne them on its shoulders for a time, allowing them to feel the scale of what lived beneath. Another tale told of waters that grew warm in the middle of a cold night. The men leaned over the rails and found the sea shimmering faintly, a glow spreading beneath, as if a furnace smouldered in the deep. From that glow rose shapes like pillars, tall and straight, moving in slow procession. Each pillar gleamed faint silver, stretching up from a body too vast to see. They swayed as though stirred by a hidden tide, brushing the surface before sinking again. The warmth lingered even after they were gone, and the men felt their breath clouding less in the chill air. They said later it was as if the sea had shown them a creature that carried fire within, a living warmth hidden in the depths, revealed only for a single night. There were other nights, when the sea gave no warmth, but a weight that pressed upon the ship, as if lowering it into hidden hands. The men felt the timbers creak, ropes strain, though the water showed no wave. Then from below came a shape like an arch, wide and tall, gleaming faintly as it drifted beneath. It stretched from one side of the ship to the other, so broad the vessel seemed a toy upon its back. The arch curved slowly, rolling as if the creature turned in its sleep, before sliding away into blackness. For hours the ship rocked on water that felt heavier than before, as though the sea had thickened with memory. The men spoke quietly, none daring to call it beast nor leviathan, for neither word seemed great enough. They simply called it the bearer, for it had lifted them as though to remind them how small they were. One account spoke of a being that revealed itself only by the marks it left upon the water. The night was calm, the sea unbroken, when circles began to spread outward from a point far beneath. At first the men thought it was a whale, but the circles widened too perfectly, each one following the next in even rhythm, stretching wider than the eye could follow. Lantern light caught faint glimmers in the rings, as if scales beneath had caught and bent the glow. The ship rocked gently, carried as though upon the breath of something moving far below. Then the circles faded, one by one, until only still water remained. The crew swore it was not chance, for no current moved so evenly, no tide pulsed with such patience. They believed they had drifted above the slow turning of a creature larger than their world. The last tale of that long stretch spoke of eyes that opened where none should be. The men had grown used to nights of quiet, watching the sea reflect the stars, when suddenly two new stars rose from below. They glowed faint blue, steady and unblinking, drifting upward until they floated just beneath the surface. The eyes moved together, sliding from one side of the ship to the other, as if studying it. For a time they lingered, casting soft circles of light upon the deck, before dimming and sinking into the black. Nothing else was seen, no body, no fin, yet the crew said those eyes held weight greater than any form could. They remembered it not as fear but as certainty, the knowledge that in the vast silence below something immense had looked upon them, and then let them go. The sailors remembered a voyage, when the sea seemed more like land than water, though no chart had ever marked such ground. For 3 days the weather had been calm, the winds slight, the surface flat enough, that lanterns showed their reflections unbroken. Men grew used to that stillness, speaking in low voices, as though even sound might disturb the balance. It was on the 4th night that the change began. The stars burned clearly overhead, and yet the ocean beneath them stirred as though restless in sleep. At first it was only a slow rise, so gentle the men mistook it for tide shifting against current. But the rise did not stop. The vessel lifted higher and higher, steadier than any wave could carry it, until the ship seemed to ride upon something vast and living. The timbers groaned softly, the ropes tightened, and silence fell among the crew as they clutched the rails, each waiting for the next breath of the sea. Then lantern light struck the surface just below, and they saw what had raised them. It was not wave, not shoal, not hidden reef. It was the curve of a back, pale and ridged, scarred with lines that stretched like valleys across a continent. The ship drifted as though balanced upon the shoulder of a sleeping giant, borne upward without struggle or threat. For a time it carried them forward, the sea itself replaced by living flesh beneath the keel, each motion slow and patient, steady as the turning of the earth. No head broke the surface, no fin struck the air, and still the men felt the weight of its presence, pressing upon them more than any storm ever had. Some whispered that they had left the sea behind and crossed into a different world, one that moved with its own rhythm, older than tide or wind. They could not see its end, nor imagine its beginning. Yet they knew without doubt they were being carried, not by chance, but by the will of whatever stirred below. At last the body began to sink. The descent was as smooth as the rise, lowering them with a care that felt almost deliberate. The water closed over it without foam or spray, and in a moment the stars shone again in their mirrored places. None of the men looked upon those reflections as they had before. They had touched something larger than ocean or earth, and though they could not name it, they knew the sea was not empty. For a single night, It had chosen to lift them, and in that choosing, it had reminded them of their size. When men spoke of the sea growing warm, they did not mean the easy warmth of a southern current. They meant heat that should not have been there. Heat that rose from below on nights when the air was sharp and their breath clouded in lantern glow. One voyage was remembered more than any other. The sea had been bitter cold through the day, the decks slick with frost. Yet as the night deepened, the water itself began to steam. The crew leaned over the rails, puzzled, for beneath them glowed a dim red light, steady and patient, as though the embers of a great fire smouldered in the abyss. The glow widened, spreading in bands that curved outward, and then a shape rose with it. At first it seemed no more than a crest breaking the surface, but as it lifted higher the men saw veins of light running through it, each one pulsing like molten rivers beneath glass. The skin shone smooth as polished stone, but alive, breathing with heat. It circled them slowly, and as it passed, the timbers of the ship warmed underfoot. They watched in silence, the glow painting the water red and gold, reflections dancing across the masts, as if the vessel itself had been set adrift in fire. No roar sounded, no wave struck, and still the men felt the weight of its power in the quiet. When at last it slipped back into the deep, the glow did not vanish at once. It sank slowly, pulsing, until only darkness remained, but the warmth lingered. For days the sea that followed them was not the same cold they had known, but soft, almost gentle, carrying them onward with a current, unlike any charted stream. Some believed they had drifted over a vent in the earth. Some thought it only a trick of weather. Yet those who had seen the veins glowing beneath the skin swore otherwise. They said it was no vent, no tide, no quirk of storm. It was a living furnace, a creature of the deep that carried fire within itself, a keeper of ancient heat moving unseen through the world. They spoke of it quietly, for it seemed wrong to give it the name of beast. It was not predator, nor prey. It was presence, a reminder that the ocean did not belong only to cold and darkness, but to hidden light as well. And in that light they had sailed, carried not by chance, but by something that rose to meet them for reasons it never revealed. There was another voyage when the sea gave its presence, not through sight, nor through warmth, but through rhythm. The ship drifted in calm waters, sails hanging slack, when the timbers began to stir. At first the men thought it was the groaning of wood, the ordinary sound of a vessel breathing against the current. Yet it was too steady, too measured. A low pulse throbbed through the hull, soft at first, then clearer, repeating at perfect intervals. The sailors fell quiet, listening as the beat grew stronger, until even the lantern glass rattled against its hooks. They looked over the rails, but the water showed nothing, save its own darkness. Then the pulse deepened into sound, a drumbeat beneath the sea, echoing not in air but in bone. The men felt it more than heard it, each thrum pressing into their chests until their hearts seemed to follow. And then it rose. The water parted without spray, and from the deep came a flank, gleaming wet and pale, ridged with lines that glowed faint silver. The grooves pulsed in the same rhythm as the sound, running like rivers of light along its side. The creature drifted slowly, circling the ship with patient grace, its presence filling the sea without ever showing its full length. Each time the rhythm struck, the grooves brightened, until the water itself seemed to beat in time. No eye surfaced, no mouth broke the waves, and yet the sailors knew they were being measured, weighed by something older than their craft, older than their nations, older than the maps they trusted. It lingered long enough for them to know it was not chance. Then it sank, silver dimming as it rolled into the deep. But the rhythm did not end. For long minutes after, the thrum continued through the hull, softer now, fading as though drawn back into the heart of the sea itself. The men stood still, waiting, and only when the silence finally returned did they dare to breathe. They spoke of it afterward as a song, not a threat, a voice that belonged not to any beast but to the ocean itself. Some swore the pulse echoed still in their dreams, steady as their own hearts, as though the sea had lent them its rhythm to remember. There came a night when the sea revealed itself, not through the lifting of a body, or the glow of hidden fire, but through a design written directly upon its surface. The ship had been drifting without haste, its crew lulled into quiet talk beneath clear stars. The ocean lay flat, so still it seemed a mirror stretched between two skies. Then, without warning, the water began to tremble. Ripples spread outward in circles, too even to be caused by wind or current. At first the men thought a stone had been dropped into the sea, though no hand had moved. But the rings widened, each perfect in its shape, until the vessel itself lay at the center. Lantern light caught the edges of the circles, and suddenly the water glowed. A pale blue shimmer traced each ring, brightening and fading in turn, as if the sea itself had been marked by a hidden hand. The glow pulsed in sequence, ring after ring, a slow heartbeat written across the surface. The men leaned over the rails, hushed, for no creature broke the water, no fin cut the waves, yet all felt the same truth. Something vast was moving below, something too deep for eyes to follow, something whose passing inscribed the water with its rhythm. The ship rocked gently with each pulse, carried not by wave, but by the breath of a presence unseen. For long minutes they drifted within that living pattern, the sea transformed into a page upon which no man could read. The rings widened, dimmed, and vanished one by one, until only black water remained. Silence returned, heavy and complete. No creature had been glimpsed, no sound recorded, yet the memory left was heavier than sight. The sailors told it later, as carefully as priests might tell a prayer. They did not call it a beast, nor monster, nor leviathan, for it had shown no body at all. Instead they called it a language, a writing of the sea, older than their charts, older than their own words, and though none could decipher its meaning, they knew it had not been meant for them alone. The ocean had spoken to itself that night, and they had been caught for a brief time, listening at its edge. There were times when the sailors believed the ocean itself wished to test them, not with storm or wave, but with something far quieter and far heavier. On one such night, the ship glided beneath a sky bright with stars, the sea calm enough that every constellation seemed doubled in the water below. The men spoke softly, their voices carrying in the stillness, when the vessel slowed without reason. No wind stirred, no rope had slipped, and yet the timbers groaned as though straining against an unseen weight. They leaned over the rails and saw nothing but darkness. Still, the ship continued to drag, as if caught in the hand of some hidden tide. Then the water lifted, not in churning swells, not in the jagged violence of storm, but in a slow rise that felt deliberate. The vessel climbed higher, tilting as though borne upon a hill of flesh. The lanterns swung, light striking across a curve that gleamed pale, just beneath the surface. It arched outward, ridged with scars that looked like valleys carved in stone. The men stood frozen, for the shape stretched far beyond what their eyes could follow. It was not a whale, nor any leviathan told in story. It was larger, steadier, and it carried them without effort. The ship balanced there for minutes, raised high upon the hidden back, rocking gently as though resting on the shoulders of the sea itself. Some of the younger men whispered prayers, others simply stared, their silence heavier than any fear. For no fin appeared, no eye glowed, no more split the waves. It did not rise to devour, nor strike. It rose to lift, to remind them of scale, to press upon them the truth that they were no more than dust floating on an older world. When at last the body began to sink, it lowered them as carefully as it had lifted them. The sea closed without foam, without ripple, stars returning to their mirrored places, as if nothing had stirred. Yet the sailors felt the difference. The surface no longer seemed a flat sheet, but a veil stretched over something immeasurable. They whispered afterward that they had not been carried by chance. It had chosen them for that brief ride, chosen to show itself without showing all, chosen to let them feel how small their vessel truly was. The voyage continued, the days passed, but the memory did not leave. Long after, when men gathered in ports, and spoke of storms survived and shoals narrowly missed, these sailors spoke more quietly. They told of the night they were lifted, not by tide, not by wind, but by the back of a living presence that never revealed its head nor tail. And they agreed on one truth: the ocean was not empty, and sometimes it carried them because it wished to be known. The calm after that rising carried the men onward for several days, yet they could not forget the feel of standing upon the back of something older than land itself. Their silence stretched into the next nights, and each time the sea grew still, they watched the horizon with unease. It was on the fifth night that the water changed again, though in a different manner. The air had grown sharp with cold breath curling in pale mist, yet beneath the rails, the sea no longer bit with its usual chill. Instead, warmth seeped upward, subtle at first, then strong enough that the deck itself began to sweat with damp. The men leaned over the side, lanterns lowered, and there they saw the glow. It began as a faint ember deep below, pulsing red like fire smothered under ash. Slowly the light widened, curling outward in great arcs, as though veins of molten stone had opened in the dark. The sailors held their breath, for the water around the ship glimmered like heated glass. Then the glow rose higher, and from it surfaced a crest, smooth and vast, shining with an inner flame. Its skin was translucent in places, revealing rivers of light that pulsed with rhythm, each vein brightening as though carrying the heat of a buried furnace. The creature did not lunge, did not thrash. It drifted with patient purpose, circling the ship in silence. As it passed, the timbers grew warm beneath the sailors' boots, and the ropes softened with dew. Reflections of fire danced across the masts, as if the vessel itself had been drawn into some subterranean forge. The men stared, spellbound, and not one raised a cry, for it seemed less like an encounter with flesh, and more with an element, as though fire itself had found a body in which to live. When at last the form sank, it did not vanish swiftly. The light receded in slow pulses, the glow sinking ring by ring until nothing remained but black water. Yet the warmth lingered. In the days that followed, the ship rode a current unlike any charted stream, a trail of softened waves that carried them faster than before. The sailors whispered among themselves, saying they had crossed the path of a being born not of bone but of flame, a hidden ember carried in the ocean's hand. No one wrote its name in the log, for no one could name it. Some called it a furnace of the deep, others the ember of the world. Yet all agreed it was not beast, not predator, not even Leviathan. It was something older, something patient, something the sea kept hidden in its depths until the night it chose to rise and remind them that not all light belonged to the stars. The warmth faded with time, and the ship returned to colder waters, where the air bit sharp and the sails stiffened under frost. Yet even there, the men carried the memory of the hidden ember that had carried fire beneath the waves. They wondered if the sea had more voices, not of flame, but of other elements, waiting to rise when it pleased. Their answer came one night when the vessel drifted without wind, and the silence grew so deep that each man heard only his own breath. Then faintly, the deck began to tremble. At first it was mistaken for the usual groaning of timber, the sigh of a ship resting on still waters. But the rhythm revealed itself quickly, not random, not scattered, but steady, slow, like a drum beaten at intervals too perfect for chance. The sound did not come through the air, but through the hull itself, vibrating upward from below. The sailors fell silent, as the beat grew stronger, pulsing through their ribs, until their hearts seemed to follow its rhythm. Each strike was low, heavy, and deliberate, as though the sea itself had taken on a pulse. Then the water stirred. A flank broke the surface, broad and gleaming, marked with lines that glowed faint silver. The grooves pulsed in time with the sound, stretching from one end of the body to the other, carrying light like rivers that brightened with every beat. The creature circled slowly, immense but unhurried, its path measured, its presence undeniable. No eye surfaced, no jaw snapped, no fin lashed. Only the rhythm, steady as a heartbeat, filling the night, until the sea itself seemed alive with sound. The men clutched the rails, their silence not born of terror, but of awe. They realized this was not a warning, nor a call for battle. It was a song, sung not for them but for the ocean. The creature drifted in a wide arc, glowing lines pulsing one after the other, and then it sank with the same patience with which it had risen. The sound lingered for a time, softer now, fading as though drawn back into the earth. At last even that ceased, and the sea lay still once more. But the sailors were not the same. They whispered later that the rhythm did not end when the sound faded. It carried on in their own chests, hearts beating slower, steadier, as though the ocean had lent them its music. For days they dreamed of it, that low rolling thrum that spoke without words, telling them that beneath the silence of water, there lay a song that had been sounding since before men learned to sail. The voyage carried them farther into waters where few ships sailed, and each man felt the weight of distance, as though the world itself had grown quieter. It was on such a night that the sea revealed one of its strangest faces. The stars burned clear overhead, countless and sharp, their reflections scattered across the black surface. For a time the sailors believed themselves surrounded by two skies, one above and one below, and they moved softly about the deck, unwilling to disturb the calm. Then the reflections shifted. At first it was only a faint bending, as though a ripple had disturbed the mirror. Yet the ripple did not fade. The points of light stretched, curving into arcs, their lines crossing until new constellations seemed to form in the water. Slowly the men saw that these shapes were not random. The stars below had bent themselves into an outline. Eyes vast and unblinking took form in the mirrored sky. A brow curved above them, and beneath, a mouth half hidden by the dark. It was not sharp, not detailed, but unmistakable. The sea was wearing the heavens as a mask, and that mask was turned upward, gazing at the ship. The sailors stood still, every man held by the weight of that image. The eyes did not glow, yet they pressed upon the crew, as though each thought had been laid bare. The mouth did not open, yet they felt words unspoken, as if the sea itself breathed beneath them, with meaning too deep to reach their ears. Minutes passed, no wave rose, no wind stirred, but the face of the ocean remained, gazing, as if studying them as carefully as they studied it. Then, with the same quiet it had come, the reflection began to unravel. The arcs bent back into scattered stars, the lines broke apart, and the water smoothed into mirror once more. The heavens above and below returned to their order, and the ship sailed on, as if nothing had shifted. Yet not one of the crew believed it had been chance. They whispered in low voices that the sea had chosen that night to look back, to borrow the sky for eyes and the stars for a mouth, so that men might know they were seen. In the days that followed, the memory weighed upon them more than any storm. Each time they looked into the water, they half expected to see the reflection bend again, to feel the pressure of that gaze upon their hearts. Some dreamed of it, waking with the certainty that those eyes had never left them. Others kept their silence, unwilling to speak of what had passed, for the telling alone felt like trespass. But all agreed on one truth: they had been measured. The sea had looked upon them, and though it had let them go, it had not forgotten. Gather itself like country, and bear a vessel across its shape, and if it wished, it could anide. The days that followed did not loosen the sea's hold upon their thoughts. Even when the winds returned, and the sails filled, the men moved with a careful hush, as if any careless sound might scatter what the ocean had chosen to show them. During this quiet stretch, the water beneath the keel began to behave like ground rather than sea. The surface lay calm, yet the ship rose and fell, as though crossing low hills set far below, and each rise was too smooth, too patient, to belong to waves. At dusk on the seventh evening, the lift gathered into a long incline, so steady that lanterns slid a finger's breadth along the deck before coming to rest. No foam broke, no gust came, but the bow climbed as if meeting a slope. What lay beneath announced itself only by pressure, a slow firming against the hull that felt almost like a hand raising them. The crew spoke in fragments, not wishing to name it too quickly, for names felt small when set against such weight. The incline eased, and the ship settled upon a high plane of water. From the rails they saw the sea's skin drawn tight and glassy, pulled across something vast. It shifted once, and the taut surface wrinkled in long lines that ran away like seams tugged in cloth. Beneath that thin skin a pallor moved, wide and gentle, patterned with faint chevrons that opened and closed like breathing. No head rose, no tail struck. The plane simply carried them forward at a walking pace, unhurried, intent, answering no command but its own. Night came without wind. Stars laid their fire upon the stretched surface, and the plane lifted once more, just enough to let the ship cross what felt like a ridge. On the far side the pressure softened, the glass slackened, the ocean fell back into itself with a sigh. The timbers felt more than heard. Only then did the men notice how carefully they had been breathing. No one called it a beast, and none called it land. They called it nearness, the moment when depth rose so close to the surface that a ship could ride its living contour. In the log they wrote little, for words seemed clumsy beside the memory. They noted the hour, the calm, the steady incline, and left the rest to be carried in the telling. Among themselves they agreed on a quiet certainty. The world below was not only a place of lifting backs or drifting eyes. It could let that shape meet the surface like a road no chart would ever draw. The plane left them to deeper water, and the days turned colder, until breath smoked in the lantern light, and frost marked the rails, like thin salt. Even so, a warmth hung in the men's speech, some ember left from what they had ridden. When the next sign came, it did not rise with heat, nor with the firm hand of lifting depth, but with a silence that thinned every sound, until even the creak of rope felt distant and small. It began as a hush that widened. The sea lost its slap against the planks, the mast stilled, the air itself felt held. Then the water under the starboard beam darkened, not shadow from cloud, for the sky lay clear, but a gloom that grew from below, round and orderly, spreading outward, until the ship rode at the edge of a great, still pool. The men leaned over, and saw threads within the gloom, pale strands arranged like a woven field, each fibre brightening and dimming by turns, as if the deep were breathing through 1,000 narrow lights. The pool drifted beneath the keel. The strands turned in slow procession, forming long ovals that slid beneath the ship, and opened again beyond the bow. No fin cut the surface, no mouth broke the calm. Yet the hush pressed harder, and each man felt his own thoughts move more quietly, as though the sea had asked for silence, and every living thing obeyed. The helmsman eased the wheel, finding no purchase. The pool carried them in its glide, setting the ship upon a path not drawn by current, and not forced by tide. When at last the darkness thinned, the strands withdrew like threads drawn back into a loom. The ordinary sounds of sailing returned in a scatter, rope against wood, breath against teeth, a boot upon plank, as if someone had lifted soft cloth from the world and let the noise breathe again. No one spoke for a time. Then the oldest hand said only that they had crossed a listening place. The word felt right. It seemed the sea had built a quiet large enough to hear itself think, and had moved the ship through that thought, with the same care a reader shows a page. They marked no name, and gave no measure. They kept the hour, and the sky and the line of their wake, though the wake itself ran smooth as ink across glass. In their chests the hush lingered. Even laughter afterward sounded rounder, kinder, as though the still pool had shaped their voices, and sent them back into the world softened by its keeping. Currents are the sea's handwriting, the men said, and most of the time a ship may read them, with a palm set flat upon the rail. Yet there came a morning when the writing grew clear enough to be a map. The wind lay idle, the canvas hung, and still the vessel began to turn, swung by a force neither tide chart nor compass could claim. The helmsman steadied the wheel, but the wheel had already chosen its answer. They slid into a slow spiral, broad and generous, as if the ocean were drawing a circle beneath them, and inviting the ship to keep its line. At first the men feared a whirl that would pull them down, but the water did not steepen, or take a bite from the hull. It smoothed instead, bright as polished slate, and the spiral widened into a path like a ramp. Seabirds, few this far out, rode the air in lazy loops that matched the shape below, as though the sky had learned the same curve. Beneath the surface, pale lines appeared, and fell away again, not lights, not scales, but the suggestion of muscles moving in long bands. The kind of power that prefers patience to show. Round they went, once, twice, 3 times, the arc easing with each turn until the circle opened toward the east, like a door pushed wider by a steady hand. The ship slipped through, set on a lane of softer water that ran straight and true, and the helmsman found the wheel his again. Behind them the spiral unspooled and faded, leaving an ordinary sea that looked as if nothing had ever been asked of it. Only the wake kept the memory, a faint silver line that held its shine longer than it should. The men watched it narrow, thoughtful, and then faced forward as one. They did not say they had been rescued or warned. They did not say they had been played with or spared. They said they had been guided, and that the guidance carried the shape of courtesy. Something great had taken the trouble to draw them a clean path through its country, and had done so without raise of voice or show of tooth. Later, when talk returned, they remembered the ease that had entered their limbs during the turning, how the body found a calmer rhythm when it moved in a circle wide enough to forget its ends. The ocean had given them that measure, and then returned them to their road. It felt like the work of an elder, no lesson called aloud, only a hand upon the shoulder that redirected a step and let the walker think he had chosen the way himself. The sea grew taller in the days that came, though the waves themselves stayed modest. What rose instead was depth, shouldering nearer to the skin of the world, as if great shapes below had drawn up for air they did not need. Near midnight, the ship crossed a boundary none could see but all could feel, the water darkened by a shade. The stars seemed to lean closer, and the air smelled of stone carried up from far places. From the bow they saw it first, a pale geometry under the surface, not rigid as a reef, and not loose as a shoal. Lines ran in diamonds and long rectangles, shifting with the flex of a body too large to know where the lines met. Low ridges lifted and fell, soft as breathing. Weed had found holds along those ridges, and small fish moved in trains that kept their distance, behaving with the careful manners of villagers who know how to walk the streets of a vast, kindly city. The ship drifted above the lattice. Now and then a larger square would open, dark and soundless, and close again as though the body below adjusted for comfort. No mouth broke the surface, no eye followed the deck. Even so, the sailors knew that whatever bore that architecture was aware of them, and had arranged itself to pass without harm. The keel touched nothing, the masts took no sudden wind. The only change was inside the men, who felt their chests lighten the way they do in wide rooms built by generous hands. Toward the stern the pattern turned graceful, diamonds becoming arcs becoming a broad avenue that led for a while, straight under their wake. They travelled together like two roads laid one upon the other, one of wood, one of living design, until the avenue dipped and the lattice softened into unmarked dark. The water brightened by a breath, the air lost its stone, the ordinary world returned with all its old noises and small shakings. They spoke of it later with the same caution one gives a blessing. It had not been a show, and it had not been a test. It had been hospitality, offered without voice, without demand, and withdrawn with the same quiet it had come. The ocean, it seemed, could become a city when it wished, a city that built itself from the body of something old and patient, and then unbuilt itself again so that ships might believe they had always sailed above formless depths. The men did not believe that any more. They knew there were streets below, and courtyards, and doors that opened and shut to the measure of a breathing larger than storm, larger than time, and kind enough to let them pass. Sailors often said the sea remembered, though not in ways men could measure. It remembered in patterns, in the rising of silence before a presence, and in the weight of calm that lingered after it had gone. On one passage the men felt this memory gather around them. The night was windless, the sky stretched open with stars, and the ocean lay dark beneath like a mirror. Then the ship slowed, not from current or tide, but as though the water itself had thickened. Ropes tightened, planks creaked, and the air pressed close. Holding breath, it did not release. They leaned over the rails and saw only stillness, but beneath that stillness, a shape began to stir. It was not light at first, nor sound, but movement, broad and slow, as though something vast was turning upon its side. The sea lifted in one long swell, and the vessel rode upward. Lanterns cast their glow across a surface that broke the water like the flank of a hill, pale, ridged, and mottled with markings, too deep to be scars, and too ordered to be chance. They resembled glyphs, symbols cut into living flesh, glowing faintly, as if traced by hidden fire. The men did not speak. The markings ran in lines across the back, curling into spirals and long arcs that glimmered before dimming again. It was as if the body itself carried a script, a writing no hand had made, carved in a language too ancient for sound. The ship drifted above this rolling text, carried without effort, the water calm despite the movement below. The sailors stared downward, their silence heavier than fear. They knew they were watching not only a creature, but a story told in its skin, a history marked in symbols that could not be read. The body curved, the ridges flexed, and the ship tilted as though passing across the spine of some great volume being turned. No roar came, no strike or surge, only the patience of something too large for haste. The markings glowed once more, then faded as the sea closed over its back. The vessel lowered smoothly, returned to its level, and the silence lifted as if the world had exhaled. When the men spoke later, they did not call it beast nor leviathan. They called it the written one, for they believed the sea had kept its oldest memories not in water, but in flesh, carved upon the body of a being that rose only when it wished to be witnessed. And in that brief witnessing, they felt as though they had been allowed to read a single page of an endless book, one written not for them, but for the ocean itself. The ocean revealed itself again, on a night when the air had turned sharp, and the sails cracked with frost. The sky was clear, the stars bright, yet the water below glimmered with a duller light, as if the deep had caught the heavens and was keeping them for itself. The ship slowed, though the wind still pushed, and the men felt the drag of unseen weight beneath the keel. Lanterns swung low, their glow spilling into the dark, and within that glow shapes began to move. At first the sailors thought them columns of stone, but no stone sways with such rhythm. These were towers, pale and tall, rising in a slow procession around the vessel. Their surfaces shone with a faint sheen, smooth as bone polished by tide, and some bent slightly toward the deck, as though listening. The men dared not speak. They stood in stillness as the forest of pillars moved past, each swaying in unison, rooted not in soil, but in the vast body that carried them. The ship drifted between them, as though down an avenue built for no human foot. Water parted without wave, and the masts trembled softly, as if the vessel itself understood it was passing through a place of ceremony. The towers glowed faintly, not bright, but enough to show that their lines bore patterns, grooves carved into living flesh, repeating like the marks of chisels. The sailors knew then that these were no idle shapes. They were the crowns of a creature carrying its own monuments upon its back. When the last tower slipped away, the sea closed again, dark and plain, and the wind caught the sails once more. No words were spoken until dawn, when the youngest among them asked if they had passed through a city. The older men answered only that the sea had shown them what it builds for itself, structures that rise and sink at will, built of flesh rather than stone. And though the towers had vanished, each man carried the same thought. There were worlds beneath the surface that mimicked their own forests and halls that no chart would ever capture, and they had walked through one without ever leaving their deck. The hush that lingered after the passing of those pillars seemed almost heavier than the sight itself. For days the men moved about the deck as though they had left some sacred hall, and dared not break the silence of its memory. Yet the sea had not finished showing its depths. On a night when the wind faltered and the sails drooped slack, the vessel began to turn without command. The helmsman held the wheel firm, but the ship traced a curve of its own, a wide, slow circle that bent the stars reflected in the water into a wheel. At first the men feared a whirlpool, the dreaded maw that would drag them down, but no steepening came, no spray or sucking rush. The water smoothed instead, gleaming like slate, polished for a ritual. Lantern light revealed faint lines rising and falling beneath the surface, not sharp like ridges, but bands that flexed in patient sequence, like muscles beneath a living skin. The vessel rode the curve in silence, and though the wheel turned beneath them, it offered no violence. Round they went once, twice, and a third time, the circle tightening then widening, as though drawn by a deliberate hand. With each turn the men felt their limbs grow lighter, their breathing slower, as if the ocean itself had laid its rhythm upon them. They realized, without speaking, that they were being guided, not trapped. The sea was not pulling them down, but leading them along a path of its choosing. At last the spiral opened toward the east, a wide channel revealed by the bending water, and the ship slipped free as gently as it had been caught. The helmsman tested the wheel again, and found it his once more. Behind them the spiral unspooled into nothing, leaving the sea flat and ordinary, as if the shape had been erased. But the men carried its impression in their chests. They said later that it had felt like being corrected by a teacher whose hand rests lightly on the shoulder, steering the pupil toward a straighter course, without a word of rebuke. When they gathered in port months later, this was the tale most often whispered, not of being spared, not of being warned, but of being redirected. The spiral had not tested them, nor threatened, but shown them that the sea could draw paths where none existed, and open doors that no map had marked. They had walked that invisible path for a single night, and though it had vanished behind them, they knew it remained waiting, to be revealed again when the sea chose to guide another ship. The voyage pressed on into waters where the horizon widened so greatly that even the men who had lived their lives at sea felt small beneath its reach. Days stretched into each other, the sun harsh by day, and the nights cold enough that frost clung to the ropes. Yet, through it all there was the same watchfulness, that quiet sense that something below carried its attention close to the ship. The sea was never entirely theirs, though they rode it daily. It belonged to something older, something that surfaced only when it wished to be known. One night, the water beneath them took on a new shape. At first it was a shimmer, faint and uncertain, like heat rising from stone. Then the shimmer steadied, becoming lines that crossed one another in long arcs, curves and lattices, forming what looked to the sailors like a design. The ship drifted directly above this pattern, lantern light falling upon its pale lines, each one glowing with a rhythm of its own. It did not move in haste, nor did it stay fixed. The shapes shifted as though the sea itself had stretched a net of light across its skin, adjusting to hold the ship within its weave. The crew stood quiet, for it felt less like passing over a creature, and more like being carried across a mind. The water swelled beneath, steady and unbroken, guiding them along a corridor of patterns that opened and closed in sequence. The shapes bent into diamonds, spirals and sweeping arcs, each fading as the next appeared, until it seemed the vessel was floating through a living manuscript written in light. No eyes watched, no jaws opened, yet the men knew without speaking that they were being considered. After some time the lattice began to fade. The arcs softened, the diamonds widened, and soon only faint traces remained, glowing like embers before vanishing into dark. The ship rode on, rocking gently, the ordinary slap of waves returning with almost jarring suddenness. None of the sailors spoke immediately, for each was turning over what they had seen, trying to fix it into memory before it dissolved. When they did speak, it was not in fear, but in reverence. They agreed the sea had opened its script to them, not all of it, not enough to read, but enough to know that meaning lay written below. They called it the lattice, a word too small but the only one they had. It was not beast, nor leviathan, nor even apparition. It was presence, patterned and deliberate, part of the deep design of the ocean. They had been given the grace to pass over it, to glimpse its marks, and then to be returned unchanged to the ordinary sea. Yet each man carried away the same conviction. The ocean was not blank, but written, and every voyage skimmed the surface of a book too vast for human eyes to read. The ocean carried them onward, though by now each man walked the deck with the sense that they travelled less upon water and more upon a threshold. The ordinary sounds of ship life continued, the slap of rope, the creak of mast, the steady rhythm of boots on plank. Yet beneath it all ran another rhythm, one drawn from memory of what they had seen. The sea no longer seemed passive. It seemed to be choosing, revealing fragments of its hidden self when it wished. then folding them back into darkness. One night, when clouds rolled low and the stars vanished, the sea took on a dim glow of its own, not bright, not sharp, but a haze that spread in rolling bands. It came from below, from depths no lantern could reach, and it shifted like breath. The ship floated above it, carried along as though placed upon a road of light. Beneath the glow moved shapes, long ridges that undulated with the patience of tides. They were not bodies in full, only hints, arcs that bent and unbent, fading and reappearing as though a procession moved beneath. The sailors stood hushed, for the glow revealed no teeth, no eyes, no roar. Instead, it offered a glimpse of continuity, of something too vast to rise all at once. They realized the sea was not filled with scattered giants, but with a single presence expressed in endless forms, rising in fragments as though to remind them that all these mysteries belonged to one deep body. The glow carried them for hours, neither fading nor growing, until dawn pressed against the horizon. Slowly the light sank, taking the ridges with it, leaving the surface blank once more. The men did not speak of leviathans, nor even of creatures. They spoke of the deep itself, alive and breathing, choosing to reveal its pulse in ways too great to capture whole. The glow of that passage lingered in their minds, long after it had sunk, and even the ordinary roll of waves felt different, as though the water itself carried memory forward. The ship pressed into colder seas, where the sky grew hard, and the wind bit with sharper teeth. Yet in that barrenness, the ocean offered another vision. It began with a hum so faint that at first the sailors mistook it for the sound of rigging, straining against the wind. But the note did not change, did not break. It deepened until the very planks beneath their boots seemed to tremble. The sound came not through air, but through wood, resonant and patient, as though the keel itself had been made into a drum. The men stood still, and in the stillness a shape began to form below. Lanterns revealed pale ridges stirring just under the surface, curved and deliberate, flexing in time with the hum. Slowly those ridges lit from within, lines of soft silver running their length, brightening and fading with each pulse. The sea was singing, though not in words. It carried rhythm in flesh, tone in motion, a song written without voice. The ship drifted at the center of this music, rocked by swells that rose in rhythm with the glowing lines. No mouth broke the water, no eyes studied them from the dark. The presence remained faceless, its only language the steady note that pressed through timber and bone alike. Some of the men said later that their own hearts had slowed to match it, as though the ocean had lent them its beat. Others swore their dreams in the nights that followed carried the same hum, guiding them into sleep, with the memory of sound that had no source. It faded as slowly as it had come. The lines dimmed, the ridges lowered, and the water smoothed again, the hum thinning until only the creak of mast and the whip of rope remained. The men stood long at the rails, watching for a return, yet none came. At dawn they spoke of it carefully, unwilling to raise their voices above the quiet. They called it not beast, nor leviathan, but tone, for they believed the sea had opened its chest for a moment, letting them hear the song that moved within it since the beginning of time. And though the voyage carried them far from that place, the silence they carried afterward was not empty. It was tuned, as though each man bore inside him a faint echo of that note, the reminder that the sea did not speak often, but when it did, it spoke in ways too deep for language. The days that followed were filled with a strange kind of watchfulness. Every creak of the mast, every ripple against the hull, seemed sharper, as though the men had learned to listen differently since hearing the sea's low hum. They moved softly about their work, careful not to drown out what might rise again beneath them. For a time nothing came, and the voyage returned to its rhythm of dawns and dusks. But on a night when the moon hung low and pale, the ocean revealed itself once more, not with sound or glow, but with form vast enough to shape the horizon. It began with a lifting at the stern, a rise so gradual that it seemed the ship had drifted upon an unseen tide. Then the swell lengthened, stretching outward, until the vessel sat perched upon a broad incline of water. From beneath, a ridge broke the surface, tall as a wall, its edges slick with glistening brine. Another followed, and another, each spaced apart like vertebrae, rolling one after the other in a procession that circled the ship. Lantern light struck across their wet slopes, showing scars cut deep as canyons, and the men realized with awe that they were riding not upon waves, but upon the slow undulation of a spine. The ridges stretched farther than sight could follow, curving round until they vanished into the black. The creature moved without hurry, lifting and lowering its back with such patience that the sea itself seemed to breathe with it. Fish scattered at its passing, breaking the surface in silver arcs, and the water glowed faintly in their wake as though carrying fragments of the beast's hidden light. The ship rocked gently, caught not in storm but in the measured gait of something older than any charted current. No head appeared, no tail thrashed, and yet the men knew the body encircled them. They were within the coil of a life too great to show itself whole, a ring drawn in flesh around their fragile craft. For long minutes it held them there, circling, the ridges rising and falling like hills rolling across a buried land. Some sailors bowed their heads, others stared wide-eyed, unwilling to blink. None dared to speak above a whisper. At last the ridges sank, the circles widening as the body drifted away into darkness. The swells smoothed, the horizon returned, and the night regained its ordinary silence. Yet the men stood long at their posts, for what they had seen pressed upon them more than fear. It was not a predator's strike, nor a storm's violence. It was the calm majesty of a presence so immense that it had chosen only to show them its back. And in that choice lay a weight greater than any terror, the certainty that the sea could surround them in silence at any moment, and that their ship was but a splinter adrift in a living world without end. The silence after the passing of that vast spine lingered like a shadow. For hours the crew spoke little, each man holding close the memory of ridges, rising like hills and circling their fragile deck. Yet the sea was not finished with them. The very next night, under skies veiled in thin mist, the water beneath took on a glow so faint it was almost hidden. At first it seemed no more than the gleam of moonlight scattered through haze, but then the glow thickened, drawing itself into long arcs that stretched side by side. The ship drifted into those arcs as into a doorway. Lanterns revealed them clearer, lines of pale blue light sweeping across the surface, bending together to form shapes too vast to belong to chance. They rose in spirals that widened and closed, coiling around the vessel, until the crew stood at the center of a great pattern, as if set upon a page written with living ink. The arcs pulsed softly, brightening, dimming, in rhythms that tugged at the men's chests. It was not the steady beat they had heard before, nor the hum that had carried through the timbers. This was subtler, a whisper in light, a language written in curves and intervals. For a long while the sailors only stared. The sea offered them no body, no eye, no head, to mark as beast. It offered only pattern, and in that pattern they felt meaning slip just beyond their reach. The shapes coiled tighter, then loosened, then spread outward again, each movement deliberate, as though they were witnessing not play but dialogue. The ship rocked lightly in their midst, carried on swells so small they seemed chosen only to keep them steady within the design. Then, as dawn began to gather, the spirals unwound. The arcs dimmed one by one, retreating into the black until the water lay blank once more. The ship rolled free, sails catching the morning's faint wind, and the crew exhaled as if waking from a dream. None tried to name what they had seen. Instead, they spoke of it as though it had been a glimpse of thought itself, the sea giving shape to its own reflection for a single night. They called it the script of water, a phrase too simple for the memory it carried, for they knew no creature had risen, yet they had stood within the mark of something vast. It had not spoken with mouth or song, but with light drawn across the surface, a fleeting geometry meant not for men, but for the ocean itself. And though it had faded, each sailor felt certain the script remained, written in depths too dark for their eyes, waiting to rise again when the sea chose to read itself aloud. The days turned grey, the sky, lowering with clouds that pressed close to the sea. Rain fell in thin veils, soft enough not to break the surface, but steady enough to blur the line between horizon and air. The men worked in silence, their cloaks heavy, the deck slick beneath their boots. Yet beneath the monotony of rain, the sea gathered itself for another unveiling. It began with a shift so subtle that only the most weathered hand noticed, a dulling of the ordinary slap against the hull, a thickening of the water's voice. The ship slowed, though the wind still drove its canvas, and the helmsman felt the wheel resist. Out from the rain-veiled surface rose a field of shapes, not ridges or spines, but soft domes, each glowing with faint pearl light. They surfaced together in dozens, then hundreds, spread wide as the eye could follow, moving with the patience of a migration. The domes pulsed gently, casting enough glow to paint the undersides of the clouds, as if the ocean had lit lanterns of its own. The vessel drifted through them slowly, each dome rising and falling with a rhythm so calm that even the rain seemed to hush. The sailors leaned over the rails, mesmerized. None spoke, for the sight carried a serenity that stilled the tongue. The domes glowed not in defiance of night, but in harmony with it, their light soft and round, like moons brought up from below. Some brushed near the hull, close enough that the men could see faint lines rippling across their skin, like breath expanding and contracting in slow unison. Others remained distant, their glow little more than haze at the edge of vision. For hours the ship passed through this living plain. No cry was raised, no fear stirred, for it seemed less like meeting a beast, and more like joining a procession already ancient when men first set sail. When at last the domes sank, they did so in silence, one by one, their lights dimming until the rain reclaimed its dominion. The sea returned to grey, the clouds hung heavy, and the vessel pressed on. The men spoke of it quietly, calling it the Field of Moons. They believed they had crossed a path used only by the ocean itself, a pilgrimage of light carried beneath the waves. And though it had let them pass, they knew the sea had reminded them once again that it was not emptiness they sailed upon, but a world filled with passages of its own, some vast, some delicate, all unseen until chosen. The rain cleared at last, leaving a stillness that felt heavier than the storm. The clouds drew back, revealing a sky washed clean, yet the sea below seemed reluctant to return to its ordinary voice. The waves were gentle, but beneath them the sailors felt something pressing, a pressure that moved with them, guiding the ship in ways no wind nor current could explain. They leaned over the rails, squinting into the black, and there they saw it, a glow rising from beneath, faint at first, then steady as it neared the surface. The glow formed into long arcs, stretching outward, like ribbons pulled taut beneath the water. They shimmered in pale blue, crossing and uncrossing, until the sea seemed woven from their strands. The ship drifted into the midst of this weaving, and the sailors held their breath as the arcs wrapped around them. For a moment it was as though they were caught in a net, but the lines did not tighten. Instead they shifted gently, moving the vessel as a hand might guide a toy boat through a basin. The men watched in silence, lanterns dim against the pale light rising from the depths. The strands pulsed in rhythm, their glow waxing and fading with the patience of breath. The ship turned slowly, angled toward a path of smoother water, and the sailors realized they were being guided once more. No creature's head appeared, no eyes fixed upon them, but the presence was unmistakable. Something vast below had chosen to lay its patterns upon the surface, weaving a corridor for them to follow. As dawn broke, the arcs unraveled, one by one they sank, the glow dissolving into ordinary waves, until the sea returned to grey. The ship carried on, its course unchanged, yet every man aboard felt they had been redirected. They whispered of it as a loom, the sea weaving and unweaving its cloth, and for a brief time setting their fragile vessel into its fabric. And though the pattern had vanished, they knew it had not gone. It remained waiting below, a net of light held in patient hands, ready to rise again when the ocean wished to remind them of its reach. The memory of the woven arcs lingered long after the glow had dissolved, and the men carried themselves as though they had stepped, for a moment, into a chamber not meant for human eyes. Their voices softened, their movements slowed, and every man turned his gaze more often to the water, waiting for the sea to speak again. It did not keep them waiting long. On the third night, after the loom of light, a change stirred beneath the bow. No glow this time, no sound, only a shifting of weight, a heaviness that drew the vessel forward, even as the sails hung limp. The ship glided into a pool of water that darkened beneath them. Not cloud, not shadow, but a gloom that seemed to thicken like ink spilled through clear glass. Slowly from that gloom rose shapes that the men first mistook for waves. They curved upward, smooth and high, their arcs unbroken, but instead of collapsing, they held their form, glistening pale against the lantern light. The shapes circled the vessel, rising one after another, until the men realized they were not waves at all, but arches, living spans of flesh, tall and deliberate, opening around the ship like the ribs of some buried cathedral. The arches did not touch the deck, yet their closeness pressed upon the sailors, like the walls of a narrowing corridor. The vessel floated at the center, its timbers groaning softly, as though in recognition. The arches pulsed faintly with light, a pale shimmer that traveled their length, fading into the dark below. The men felt themselves held within a chamber, made not by stone nor hand, but by a living body that had chosen to shape itself into walls. For what felt like hours, the ship drifted between those towering arcs. Some sailors stood rigid, hands white on the rails. Others bowed their heads as though in prayer. None spoke above a whisper, for the place itself seemed to demand reverence. And then, as silently as it had risen, the cathedral unmade itself. The arches sank, one by one, their curves breaking apart into ripples, until the sea lay flat once more. The stars above returned, reflected clear in the water, as though no shape had ever disturbed them. The men did not argue over what they had seen. Each knew. The sea had raised its body into a hall, and for a brief span of time, they had been its guests. They called it the Arches, though the word was too small, and they agreed it had not been a threat, nor a test. It had been a reminder that the ocean was not only depth and silence, but also structure, capable of lifting itself into forms more deliberate than any storm. They had passed through a place of ceremony, and though it vanished behind them, the weight of its memory traveled with them still. The sea has many ways of showing itself, and by now the men had learned that not all of them came with light or with form. Sometimes its presence was revealed only by stillness, and it was in such a stillness that they found themselves one night, adrift beneath a sky cold with stars. The sails hung loose, the ropes lay quiet, and the water seemed less like a surface than a sheet of glass, stretched tight beneath their hull. Each man stood watchful, for they had come to know that such stillness was never empty. The first sign was the reflection. Stars mirrored in the water began to warp, bending not with ripple, but with deliberate shift. The constellations broke apart, drawn into long arcs, then spirals, until the sea's mirror no longer matched the sky. From these distortions emerged a shape too vast to mark by edges alone. At first it seemed a face, vast and patient, but as the spirals turned the form changed, opening into eyes one moment, then a mouth, then something like wings stretching outward across the sea's skin. The crew stared, struck silent. No sound came from the water, no breath of wind carried across the deck, but the shifting shapes pressed upon their thoughts, as surely as if a voice had spoken. Some felt their hearts slow, others their breath catch, as though each man were being addressed in silence. The shapes moved with rhythm, rising and collapsing, folding in upon themselves before stretching outward again. It was not a creature in flesh, nor a body in full. It was a vision, drawn from the bending of the world's own reflection, a message written not in word but in distortion. Minutes passed, though none aboard could later measure them. Then the spirals loosened, the arcs softened, and the stars returned to their rightful order. The sea lay flat again, mirror to the heavens, and the ship rocked once as if to signal that the vision had ended. The men stood for a time, not daring to break the silence, and when they finally spoke it was in whispers. None agreed on what had been seen, face, wing, or mouth, but all agreed that they had been addressed, if only for a breath of time. They called it the mirror's mask, not a creature, not even a presence in the old sense, but the sea borrowing the sky to show them how easily their world could be rewritten. and though the reflection had settled, the memory did not. In every pool of calm that followed, in every night when stars lay bright and steady upon the water, the men searched for the mask to return. It did not. Yet the possibility lingered, and with it came the quiet understanding that the sea could at any time remake the heavens upon its surface, bending stars into shapes that no man could ignore. The voyage carried them into waters that bore no birds, no driftwood, not even the stray weed that sometimes marked a hidden current. It was emptiness that weighed heavier than storm, and the men felt it pressing in from all sides. The sea was dark, the air still, and the horizon seemed to close like a ring around them. Then from below came the first flicker. At once the sailors thought of lanterns dropped from another vessel, but no mast could be seen, no call reached their ears. The flicker grew into a glow, faint green at first, then steady, spreading in a wide circle beneath the ship. They leaned over the rails, their faces lit from below, and saw shapes begin to rise within the circle. Not backs nor fins, but orbs, round and luminous, swelling upward, like bubbles that refused to burst. Dozens at first, then hundreds. They crowded the water, pale lights floating just beneath the surface. Some brushed close to the hull, others hovered far out, yet all of them pulsed in rhythm, brightening and dimming, as though breathing together. The ship was surrounded, floating upon a sea of slow, patient eyes. The sailors whispered, but the sound died quickly, smothered by the weight of what encircled them. The lights gave no threat, no surge, only presence. Their rhythm slowed the men's own hearts, until every breath seemed to fall into step with the glow. They stayed that way for what felt like hours, drifting in the company of silent watchers. Then, as dawn colored the horizon, the lights sank. One by one the orbs dimmed, their glow receding into black, until only water remained. The ship rocked gently, the world resuming its ordinary sounds. But none aboard were unchanged. They spoke of the orbs as lanterns of the deep, guardians not of men, but of the sea itself, surfacing to watch and then sinking again, when their measure was taken. And though the lights had gone, each man felt their gaze linger, as though the ocean had not turned away, but had only closed its eyes to rest. The memory of those lanterns of the deep clung to the sailors long after their glow had sunk, and every man found himself glancing more often over the rails, half expecting the orbs to rise again. But the sea is never the same twice, and when it chose to reveal itself next, it did so in a way unlike any before. The night was still, the sails slack, the stars mirrored sharp and clear in the water. Then, without warning, the reflections began to move. At first the sailors thought it a ripple, the ordinary warping of light across a stirred surface. But the stars bent not outward but inward, twisting into spirals that reached toward the ship. The water darkened, swallowing the lesser lights until only a few remained, gathered into shapes too deliberate to be chance. Slowly from the distortions emerged what seemed to be a mouth vast enough to swallow the vessel whole. Its outline was faint, traced only by absence of starlight, yet the men saw it as plainly as they saw the deck beneath their feet. The ship rocked once. Though no wind had stirred, the mouth lingered there, unmoving, as though waiting. Some sailors gripped the rails, others lowered their heads, but none dared to speak. The longer they stared, the more they felt the shape was not hunger but message, a reminder of scale written upon the surface of the world. For a time it held, vast and silent, until the stars slipped back into their places, scattering once more across the water. The sea lay still again, yet the men did not. Each carried the weight of that vision, the knowledge that they had been allowed to see not a creature in flesh but an image the ocean had chosen to draw. They called it the mouth of night, though they admitted it was not truly a mouth at all. It was the sea bending the heavens into shape, letting them know they were always but one breath away from being swallowed into its endless depth. And so they sailed on, sails filling with the faint dawn wind, their voices hushed. The reflection had passed, but the memory of being looked upon through a mask of stars stayed with them, heavy as the deep. The days that followed the vision of the mouth of night passed in uneasy calm. The men worked as before, hauling rope and trimming sail, but their eyes turned often to the sea, as though expecting the reflection to twist once more. It was not the stars that moved next, but the water itself. On an evening when the horizon blurred into haze, and the wind had stilled, the ocean beneath began to shine with a pallor like moonlight trapped below the surface. The glow gathered into lines, first straight, then bending, until the ship drifted over a design too vast to follow. Arcs unfurled like petals, curling outward in measured rhythm, each glowing bright and fading back again. At first the sailors thought it a flower blooming in slow silence. Then the arcs shifted, folding inward, the petals collapsing and reforming into spirals that drew the ship into their center. The vessel rocked gently, carried not by wave, but by the deliberate turning of the pattern beneath. The men gripped the rails, but no violence came. The spirals opened and closed with calm patience, each movement precise, as if the sea had become a clock marking its own time. The sailors felt their breath slow to its rhythm, each inhalation following the opening arcs, each exhalation the closing. It was not trap, nor threat, but measure, a demonstration of the ocean's ability to shape itself into order more perfect than any crafted by men. They remained within the spirals until the night grew old. Then the light began to thin, the petals dimming one by one, the arcs softening into ordinary darkness. When at last the sea lay blank again, the men found themselves breathing harder, as if they had been released from a rhythm not their own. They looked at one another with quiet certainty, for each knew what had held them was no beast, but a design, a living geometry drawn upon the surface for reasons beyond their guessing. Later, in ports where tales are traded as eagerly as coin, they told of it in hushed voices. Some said it was the sea's way of showing its pulse. Others said it was a warning, a reminder that what appears chaotic is ordered at depths too far for men to fathom. All agreed on one truth. They had drifted within a pattern meant not for them but for the sea itself, and for one night they had been part of its design. The spirals had faded, yet the sense of order they carried lingered in the minds of the sailors. They went about their work with a kind of quiet reverence, as though they had been reminded that every wave was only the visible edge of deeper patterns. The sea seemed content to let them sail for several days without sign, but the men never relaxed. They knew by now that stillness was no emptiness, and when the ocean chose to reveal itself again, it did so in a manner that felt less like a vision and more like a judgment. It began in the deep of night, when even the stars appeared dimmed by haze. The ship rocked gently, untroubled by wind, when the lanterns along the deck faltered. Their light bent, as though caught in a hand cupped over a flame, until the glow grew weak, and shadows pressed close. The sailors checked their oil, checked the wicks, but the fault was not in the lamps, it was in the water beneath. A darkness had risen there, so heavy and complete, that it swallowed the lantern glow before it could spread. The ship seemed to float above a pit, without bottom. The sea gave no ripple, no wave, only stillness, as though they hovered on the edge of a void. Then, from that void, a flank brushed against the hull, pale and vast. Its skin bore lines like scars running deep across it, some straight, some curling into arcs. The ship rocked slightly, not from impact, but from the enormity of what passed. It lingered, sliding slowly along the length of the vessel, close enough that the men could feel the air grow cooler, as if it carried with it the cold of some deeper world. For a long moment it stayed there, neither rising fully nor sinking away. The crew felt it as presence more than sight, a nearness that pressed upon their lungs until each breath grew shallow. And then, with the same patience it had shown in arriving, it slipped back into the black, leaving the ship adrift once more. The lanterns brightened, shadows receded, and the world seemed to return, yet none aboard felt the same. The men did not speak of attack, nor even of wonder. They spoke of permission. It had allowed itself to be known, and it had withdrawn, not in anger, not in haste, but in choice. And that choice carried more weight than any storm, for it left them with the understanding that the sea did not merely hold such presences, it decided with deliberate will when to let them be seen. And though it had chosen to pass them by, each man knew it had measured them in silence before it left. The sea had weighed them and passed them by, yet its memory lingered like salt on their tongues. Each man carried the silence differently, some with unease, others with reverence, but all with the knowledge that they had been measured. The voyage pressed on, sails snapping when winds returned, but even the ordinary sounds of rope and mast seemed quieter, subdued beneath the weight of what had touched them. It was during one such night of uneasy calm that the ocean revealed a presence unlike any they had seen before, not vast and solid, but shifting, restless and endless in shape. It began as a faint glimmer just beneath the bow, a thin ribbon of light twisting in the black. The sailors leaned over the rails, expecting it to vanish, yet it lengthened instead, curling upon itself until it looped around the ship. Then another ribbon joined it, and another until dozens spiraled together, weaving a slow, glowing braid that wrapped the vessel in silence. The light was soft, pale green at first, but deepened into blue as it thickened, pulsing faintly like the breath of some unseen chest. The men stood mesmerized, for the ribbons moved with intention, never colliding, always sliding over and under each other, in patterns too precise for chance. The longer they watched, the clearer it became that they were not witnessing many creatures, but one. A single body had divided itself into strands, weaving through the water like hair adrift in tide, enclosing the ship within its restless embrace. The braids curled higher, brushing against the hull with the faintest touch, and wherever they passed, the wood hummed with a resonance low and steady, as though the vessel itself had been tuned to the sea's hidden note. For hours the braids circled them, sometimes drawing tight enough to narrow the path forward, sometimes loosening to allow the ship more space. Never once did the motion quicken, never once did it strike. It only wound and unwound, as though the ocean were demonstrating the infinity of its own form, reminding the sailors that it could divide and multiply itself at will. At last, as dawn drew faint light over the horizon, the braids began to dissolve. One by one the ribbons of glow straightened, thinning into single lines that slipped back into the deep. The hum faded, the water steadied, and the ship was left alone upon an empty sea. When they spoke of it later, the men did not call it a beast, nor a leviathan, nor even a presence. They called it the braids, for they had seen the ocean knot itself into patterns no man could ever unweave. They whispered that the sea had shown them infinity in motion, a living form that could change endlessly without losing its whole. And though it had vanished, they carried the knowledge that beneath them, the ocean held shapes uncountable, each waiting to rise and bind the world in silence for as long as it pleased. The braids had shown them infinity in motion, a body dividing and uniting itself without end. Yet the sea did not leave them long with only memory. On another night, when the horizon blurred into haze, and even the stars seemed reluctant to burn, the water below the keel began to throb with a dim, uneven glow. It was not constant. It pulsed, bright, then dim, then bright again, like a heart struggling to keep its rhythm. The sailors leaned over the rails, watching the glow shift and falter. At first they thought it the work of some deep fire, unsteady in its burning, but then the pulses grew clearer. Each flare of light rose with the rhythm of something alive, and from the glow a surface lifted. It was broad, pale, and scarred with trenches that cut across it like the dried beds of vanished rivers. The pulses travelled along these scars, filling them with silver, then letting them darken again, as though the very wounds of this being had become vessels of light. The ship rocked gently as the vast surface shifted below, and the men clung to the rails. Some swore they felt their own hearts stutter in time with the glow, speeding when it brightened, faltering when it dimmed. The creature circled once, drawing the vessel into the orbit of its failing rhythm, then sank again, leaving only a final flare before darkness reclaimed the sea. For long minutes no one spoke. The crew felt unsteady, some clutching their chests as though their own pulses had not yet returned to normal. At last the oldest sailor whispered that they had been bound to another heart for a time, drawn into its struggle, and then released. None argued. Each man felt the truth of it in his bones. They called it the wounded one, not because it had struck at them, nor because it had sought pity, but because its body bore scars that glowed with a rhythm imperfect, fragile, and deeply human in its failing. And though it vanished into the dark, The men carried away the uneasy knowledge that even the sea's hidden giants bore wounds, and that in sharing them, the ocean had reminded its passengers that all life, no matter how vast, carries weakness written into its flesh. The wounded one had left them shaken, not by its size, but by its frailty. The sea had always been imagined as infinite and unyielding, yet here was proof that even its hidden bodies could falter, carrying scars that pulsed with imperfect light. The men spoke less boldly after that night. Their laughter, when it came, was brief and subdued, as though they feared the ocean might overhear and decide to remind them again of its quiet power. Several evenings later, as the sky deepened to indigo and the wind dropped to a whisper, another presence announced itself. It began with a thin line of brightness across the horizon, too low for dawn, too steady for lightning. The line stretched wider until it circled them on every side, a ring of light humming just beneath the surface. The ship floated at the center, held within a boundary no chart had ever marked. The sailors watched in awe as the ring rose. At first it seemed only water catching some trick of glow, but soon shapes emerged from it. Long columns rising vertically, pale and translucent, arranged as evenly as the stones of a temple. They glowed faintly, their surfaces etched with striations that resembled carvings, though no hand had touched them. The columns swayed in rhythm, not bending with current, but with the breath of the body that held them. For the men it was as though the ocean had raised walls around them, creating a hall vast enough to house the sky itself. The vessel drifted slowly between those living pillars, no sound but the creak of timbers, and the faint hiss of water sliding past. Lanterns seemed dim beside the pale glow, and the sailors whispered that they had entered a chamber, older than time, one built of flesh instead of stone. Some lowered their heads, others pressed their hands to the rails, steadying themselves as though afraid to stumble in so solemn a place. After what felt like hours, the pillars began to sink. One by one they faded, dissolving back into dark water, until only the encircling ring remained. That too dimmed, leaving the ship adrift once more in ordinary sea. The men exhaled together, their breath loud against the returning silence. Later they would call it the colonnade, not beast, not leviathan, but a structure raised for reasons beyond their imagining. Some said it was the ocean building a hall in which to remember itself. Others said it was meant to remind men that the sea had its own architecture, grander and older than any temple ever raised upon land. Whatever its purpose, the sailors knew they had been enclosed within it for a span of time, and the memory of those glowing pillars left them quieter, more careful, as they pressed onward into the endless dark. The colonnade faded behind them, but the memory of those living pillars held fast, and the men spoke of little else for days. They moved softly upon the deck, lowering their voices even when laughter rose, as though they had stepped out of a temple and feared to break its silence. Yet the ocean is never still for long, and soon it chose to show them something stranger still, an image not built of flesh nor glow, but of shadow drawn against the stars. It came on a night when the sky was clear, and the constellations burned sharp above. The water lay calm, black as polished stone, and the ship's wake cut silver threads across it. The first sign was the dimming of a handful of stars. The sailors tilted their heads, expecting cloud, but no cloud passed. Instead, the stars themselves seemed to fade, smothered by something rising between heaven and sea. Slowly, a vast shadow surfaced, not from above, but from below, blotting out the mirrored sky upon the water. The shadow spread outward, its edges too smooth to be smoke, too measured to be mist. It was round, immense, and it moved with the patience of a drifting continent. The men clutched the rails, their silence broken only by the creak of timber as the ship tilted gently with its passage. No light came from it, no sound escaped it. It was absence itself, a vast negation sliding beneath their vessel, erasing stars wherever it passed. The sailors stood transfixed, for it was not shape alone that unsettled them. It was the certainty that the shadow carried weight. Though it touched nothing, though it brushed no hull, every man felt it pressing on his chest, as if their breaths were being measured by the black mass below. For long minutes it lingered, stretching beyond sight, swallowing the mirrored constellations one after another, until the sea seemed stripped of its heavens. Then just as slowly, it withdrew. The stars returned in patches, their reflections mended upon the water, and soon the sky above and below lay whole again. The ship righted itself, rocking gently, the pressure lifting from the men's lungs. Some drew deep breaths, others pressed their palms flat against the deck, grounding themselves in wood and nail. No one spoke until the silence had fully passed. They named it only once, in whispers, the great absence. It was not creature, not leviathan, not apparition. It was void given body, a reminder that the sea did not need form or light to reveal its reach. In its shadow the men had felt their scale more sharply than ever before, not hunted, not even noticed, merely dwarfed. And though the absence had slipped away, the certainty it left behind remained unshakable. The ocean could take not only sight, but meaning, folding the world into silence whenever it chose. The ocean had shown them the great absence, and for many nights afterward the sailors moved with caution, as though their steps upon the deck might disturb what lay waiting beneath. Yet the sea is not bound to repeat itself. When it chose to reveal its next face, it came with light rather than shadow. The night was windless, the sails heavy, and the water so flat that stars burned double in its mirror. Then from the deep rose a faint shimmer, spreading outward like the first hint of dawn. The shimmer grew into arcs, crossing and recrossing, until they formed circles upon the surface. They did not drift, nor break into ripples. Each circle held fast, pulsing gently, as if marked by a hidden hand. The ship drifted among them, lanterns swinging low, and the men whispered of rings laid out, like offerings upon the sea. With each pulse, the circles glowed brighter, their edges sharp, their centers dark, until the vessel seemed caught within a field of countless eyes, all gazing upward in silence. For a long while the crew stood frozen, unable to decide whether they were watched or welcomed. The circles did not close, did not narrow, but widened, one after another, stretching until they touched the horizon. The sea had inscribed itself with patterns too vast for any map, and the ship was at its heart. The men breathed in rhythm with the pulses, their bodies caught in the same slow measure that rolled through the water. At last, as the sky paled toward dawn, the circles began to fade. One by one they thinned, dissolving into the dark, until only ordinary ripples remained. The sailors exhaled together, released from a silence they had not known they were holding. They called it the Field of Rings, and they spoke of it with the care one uses when recalling a prayer. For they believed the sea had not merely shown them light, but written something upon its surface, something not meant for men, yet shared with them for a single night, so that they might remember how little of the ocean's language they truly understood. The Field of Rings faded as dawn claimed the horizon, yet the impression of having stood within a living pattern did not leave them. For days afterward, the crew found themselves watching the sea with the uneasy knowledge that at any moment it might inscribe itself anew, and soon enough, it did. On a night when clouds rolled low and the air held the weight of rain, the sea stirred in a manner too deliberate for wind or current. It began with a ripple that spread in lines instead of circles. The ship drifted upon them, lantern light catching faint gleams that ran like threads in cloth. These lines crossed, bent and recrossed, until the men realized they were sailing not upon water, but upon a woven surface. The sea had made itself into fabric, each ripple a strand, each gleam a stitch in a vast shifting tapestry. The vessel glided forward, and the pattern shifted beneath. Diamonds widened into arcs, arcs folded into chevrons, and all the while the glow moved through them like a shuttle, pulsing in steady rhythm. The sailors whispered that they had entered the loom of the sea, and the ship was being carried upon its weaving. The air grew hushed, heavy with the sound of their own breaths, as though even the sky listened for the rhythm below. For hours the design held, altering but never breaking, and each change brought with it a new form too vast to name. Some sailors swore they saw the outlines of wings folded and spread. Others claimed to glimpse faces, eyes gazing upward through the lattice. No one agreed, but all felt the certainty that the ocean was not weaving for them, but for itself, caught in some ancient ritual older than tide. At last, as rain began to fall, the weaving unraveled. Threads straightened, their glow dimming until the sea returned to ordinary grey. The men breathed easier, though their silence lingered. Later they would tell of it as one might recall a vision at the edge of sleep, uncertain, yet undeniable. They called it the loom, and they carried away the knowledge that the sea could shape itself into a tapestry whenever it wished, drawing lines across its own skin until ships became nothing more than passengers drifting upon its endless design. The loom of the sea had unsettled even the most hardened among them, for it was not simply the sight of glowing threads or shifting shapes that lingered. It was the sense that they had drifted across something alive, that was thinking, weaving meaning in forms too large for their understanding. For several nights they slept poorly, listening for the sound of the water pulling itself into order again. But the ocean had another way of revealing itself, one that came not through weaving, but through silence shaped into chambers. On the 5th night after the loom, the wind died entirely. The sea became flat as stone, and the ship sat adrift, its sails slack. Lantern light stretched far across the surface, clear and steady, until suddenly it stopped. A sharp boundary appeared in the water, a line beyond which no reflection passed. The men leaned over the rails, and saw that the sea had turned black, not in shadow but in substance. It was as if they had drifted onto a floor of ink, and that floor did not stir. Then from the edge of the black, shapes began to rise. They were tall and narrow, pale against the void, bending as they surfaced like ribs curving upward from a buried spine. More followed, forming a corridor that reached out ahead of the vessel. The ship drifted into it without sound, timbers groaning softly, as though they recognized the weight of what carried them. The ribs arched overhead, some nearly brushing the masts, until the crew found themselves sailing through a tunnel made not of stone nor wood, but of living presence. No cry came from below, no strike against the hull. The chamber simply held them, carrying the vessel forward at a pace not their own. The silence pressed upon them, heavy as water, until every man's breath seemed too loud. Some closed their eyes, unwilling to stare at the ribs glowing faintly above. Others stared straight ahead, waiting for the chamber to release them. At last, after what felt like hours, the arches sank. One by one they slipped beneath the surface, leaving only the ink-dark water, which itself faded into ordinary sea. The reflections returned, stars glimmering once more upon the surface, and the ship rocked gently as wind filled its canvas again. When they spoke later, the sailors called it the hall, not beast, nor apparition, but a chamber the sea had raised for its own reasons. Some said it was a passage, others a warning, but all agreed on one truth: they had been carried through a space meant not for men but for the ocean itself. And though the hall had vanished, the memory of its ribs lingered in their dreams, curving above them in silence that felt too deliberate to forget. The hall of ribs faded into memory, but its weight lingered upon the men. They carried themselves with care, as if still walking beneath those arches, unwilling to break the silence the ocean had laid upon them. Days passed, the horizon stretching wide and empty, until one evening, the water darkened in a way none had seen before. It was not storm cloud, nor gathering squall, but a deepening from below, as if the sea itself had thickened into ink. The ship slowed, its bow pushing through water that resisted like oil. Lanterns cast their glow downward, but the light stopped short, swallowed by the dark as though pressed against a wall. Then slowly, shapes began to appear within the gloom, circles vast and pale, drifting upward, like discs rising from the abyss. The men watched in silence as they spread outward, some the size of the deck itself, others stretching wide enough to swallow the vessel whole. They overlapped, layer upon layer, forming a canopy of luminous rings that pressed against the underside of the sea. The sailors clutched the rails, for the circles were not still. They pulsed, fading and brightening in sequence, each one answering another, until the entire canopy rippled with rhythm. It was not the chaos of waves, nor the steady beat of a heart, but a pattern, measured, deliberate, and immense. The ship rocked gently beneath it, as though caught in a breath too slow for human lungs. The men whispered that the ocean itself was breathing through those rings, exhaling light into its own body. For hours the canopy held. The sailors stood motionless, unwilling to disturb its rhythm, feeling as though they had intruded upon a ritual not meant for them. Some swore the rings shifted into faces, vast and solemn, watching them from beneath the water. Others said they were simply the ocean's lungs, inhaling and exhaling in silence. Whatever the truth, all agreed that they had never felt so close to being part of something not human, not beast, but elemental. At last the circles began to dim. One by one they thinned, shrinking back into the abyss, until the water lay black once more. The ship drifted free, the lantern light spreading again across ordinary waves, the stars returning to their mirrored places. The men exhaled in unison, as if only then allowed to breathe. Later they spoke of it with caution, calling it the canopy, for it had stretched above them like a ceiling made of light and shadow. Some believed it was a body vast enough to blanket the surface of the world. Others thought it was not body at all, but breath given form. Whatever it had been, the sailors carried away the knowledge that the sea could close above as easily as it could open below, and that for one night, they had sailed beneath a roof the ocean itself had raised. The canopy had shown them how the sea could raise a roof above their fragile deck, closing them within its breadth, as if they were no more than dust in a great chamber. Afterward, even when the waters lay calm, the men looked upward with unease, half expecting the sky itself to vanish beneath another living veil. For a time the ocean kept its secrets, letting them sail through ordinary days of creaking masts and steady wakes. But on the seventh night, when the moon was hidden and the stars burned sharp and cold, the surface began to ripple in ways no wind could stir. At first the ripples seemed random, spreading in gentle rings across the water. Yet soon they gathered into order, moving in perfect sequence, rolling toward the ship in waves that did not break. Each line passed beneath the keel, with the same slow rhythm, as if the ocean were lifting the vessel into its pulse. The sailors leaned over, their eyes narrowing against the dark, and then they saw it. Bands of pale light deep below, moving like ribs that rose and fell with each undulation. The ship drifted upon them, carried not by tide, but by the rise and fall of a body, vast enough to turn the sea into its breath. The bands glowed faintly, curving into arcs so wide they vanished beyond sight. Yet their rhythm was steady, patient, and irresistible. The men felt their own lungs move with it, their chests rising and falling in time with the glow. For a moment it seemed they had been drawn into another being's breathing, folded into its life, as easily as a drop of rain is folded into the ocean. The rhythm lasted long, unbroken, and though no head appeared, no eye watched, the sailors knew they were upon the chest of something that did not need to reveal more. It had chosen to show them its breath, and in that breath they felt both awe and unease. For what is breathing but proof of life? And if the ocean itself breathed, then who could claim to know the limits of its body? When the bands at last dimmed, the ripples faded, and the water stilled, the ship rocked gently, released, the night sky returned to calm. Yet the sailors did not forget. They whispered of it as the breathing one, a presence that had allowed them to rest upon its silent respiration, making them part of a rhythm too vast to name. And though the sea had quieted, each man carried the memory in his chest, his own lungs recalling the measure of a being that had folded them into its breath for one long unbroken night. The breathing one had carried them on its rhythm, and though the glow of its vast lungs had vanished, the men could not forget the feel of their own chests, moving in time with something so much greater. They carried that measure into the days that followed, their tasks made quiet by memory. Yet the ocean had more to show, and when it came, it did not rise with breath, but with silence deeper than any they had yet known. The night was calm, the sky clear, and the sea so flat that the vessel drifted as though suspended. Then the sounds began to fall away. First the slap of water against the hull, then the creak of mast, the hiss of rope. Even the men's voices thinned until their whispers seemed stolen by the air. A hush spread outward in widening rings, not heard but felt, pressing against their ears like the weight of depth itself. The ship floated at the center of this silence. Lanterns burned without flicker, yet their glow seemed swallowed, dimmed by something beneath. Slowly the water blackened, not with shadow, but with substance. Within that black, faint sparks appeared, like embers scattered across a dark floor. The sailors watched as they brightened, forming constellations that did not match the stars above. Shapes emerged, spirals, grids, long arcs, glowing in deliberate rhythm, as though the ocean had laid a second sky beneath them. The vessel drifted forward, its path carried not by tide, but by the turning of those constellations. The crew leaned over, transfixed, for it seemed they were sailing between heavens, one above, one below, each watching the other. Some swore they saw faces in the patterns, vast outlines shifting in and out of shape. Others said the sparks formed only language, a script too old to be read. Whatever its truth, all agreed that the silence pressed harder, as if demanding they listen with more than ears. For long minutes, perhaps hours, they sailed upon this mirrored firmament. Then as dawn touched the horizon, the sparks dimmed. The constellations unraveled, the black faded to grey, and the ordinary slap of water returned to the hull. The sailors breathed easier, though none laughed. They spoke of it as the night of two skies, a time when the ocean had opened a silence wide enough to hold its own stars. And though those stars had vanished, the memory of their light lingered, a reminder that the sea was not emptiness, but another sky lying in wait beneath their keel. The night of two skies left them restless. They went about their duties with eyes lowered, their minds still caught between the constellations above and those they had seen glowing beneath. Some men whispered that the sea had shown them its heaven, others that it had revealed a memory older than the stars themselves. Yet none could dismiss the weight of it, and when the ocean stirred again, it came not as light nor silence, but as a motion so immense that the ship seemed no more than driftwood upon its back. The evening was calm, the horizon a faint line of silver, when the keel began to lift. Not sharply, not with the violence of storm, but slowly, steadily, as though the ship were rising upon the shoulders of something vast. The swell grew taller, broader, until the lantern light struck the surface of what bore them upward. It was pale, smooth, and scarred in long grooves that stretched farther than sight. The men gripped the rails, for the deck tilted under the weight of being carried, not by tide, but by body. The vessel rocked as the curve beneath shifted. It was not a single ridge, not one arc of flesh, but a succession of them, each rising and falling like rolling hills. They spread outward on every side, circling the ship in patient rhythm, enclosing it as though it drifted upon the back of a living continent. The men stared outward, their silence broken only by the groaning of timbers. Some pressed their hands to the deck, feeling the vibration of what lay below. Others turned their eyes upward, unwilling to meet the vastness unfolding around them. For hours the creature circled, its ridges rising and sinking with the patience of a world moving beneath the sea. It made no sound, revealed no head or tail, and yet its presence was absolute. The sailors whispered that they had entered the orbit of a body too great to reveal itself whole, a ring drawn of flesh around their fragile vessel. Some swore the stars themselves tilted, bent by the pull of its motion. At last the ridges began to sink. One after another they faded into the dark, the sea smoothing as though nothing had ever passed. The ship righted, sails catching the faintest breeze, and the men exhaled in unison, freed from the weight pressing upon them. Later they called it the Circling One. Not beast, not leviathan, but a presence that had enclosed them in its patient orbit. It had not struck, not threatened, but simply surrounded, as if to remind them of scale. And though it had vanished into the abyss, the men carried the certainty that the sea could close its rings around them at will, and that they would have no choice but to drift within its embrace until it chose to let them go. The Circling One had shown them the patience of a presence, so large it could enclose their vessel in silence, without strike or roar. Yet the ocean, restless in its ways, did not leave them long to recover. A new vision came when the air was warm and the sea lay clear as glass, so still that the sky doubled perfectly beneath their keel. For a time the men took comfort in this calm, believing themselves granted a rare passage untouched by storm. But calm is the sea's oldest disguise, and soon the surface began to change. It started with a shimmer, faint as breath upon a mirror. The reflection of the stars wavered, bent, then bent again until entire constellations curled into spirals. The sailors leaned over the rails, eyes wide, as the mirrored sky unraveled beneath them. Shapes formed in its place, faces vast and solemn, their outlines traced not by light, but by the absence of it. A brow stretched across the water, eyes opened where no ripple stirred, and a mouth shaped itself from darkness alone. The sea had borrowed the sky's reflection to make a mask, and that mask gazed upward, fixed upon the fragile ship. The men froze, caught in the weight of its attention. No sound came, no swell disturbed the hull, yet each sailor felt as though the face pressed upon him alone, stripping his thoughts bare. Some bowed their heads, unable to meet its gaze. Others stared on, transfixed, hearts thundering against the silence. The mask did not shift quickly. It lingered, studying them in stillness, a presence without breath, yet heavy with will. Then, as slowly as it had formed, the features began to blur. The mouth softened, the eyes dissolved, the brow unraveled into scattered points of starlight. Within moments the mask was gone, and the sky above returned whole to the sea below. The water lay still once more, the reflection clear, as if nothing had ever broken its order. Yet the crew did not move at once. They stood at the rails long after, unwilling to break the silence that still clung to their skin. When at last words returned, they spoke in whispers. Some called it the Watcher, others the Mirror's Mask, but all agreed that it had not come to threaten, it had come to look. The sea, they said, had lifted the heavens and shaped them into eyes, so that men might know they were not alone upon its back. And though the mask had vanished, each sailor carried away the conviction that it had not truly gone. It had only closed its features, waiting to open them again when the ocean wished to remind them that every reflection could, at any moment, gaze back. The sea carried them onward, with deceptive calm. By now the men had learned that stillness was only another mask, and they moved with the caution of those who knew the world beneath was never idle. On one such night, when the stars burned sharp, and the wind whispered only faintly, the water began to thicken. It did not ripple or foam, but grew heavy, as though it had taken on the weight of glass. The ship slowed, its timbers groaning, and the lanterns cast long beams across a surface too smooth to be ordinary. Then from the deep, a single line rose. It was faint at first, pale as chalk beneath dark glass, but it brightened steadily, climbing upward, until it stretched the length of the ship. More lines followed, parallel and endless, each glowing faintly, until the sea beneath became a field of bars. They did not shift or bend, but held steady, as though the ocean had folded itself into a cage. The men leaned over, their breath caught in their throats. The bars stretched outward beyond sight, each one rising and falling, with subtle motion, like the ribs of a chest inhaling. They realized the ship was caught within a vast lattice, carried not upon waves, but upon the slow breathing of a body, immense enough to shape the sea into geometry. The lines pulsed faintly, each brightening in turn, until it seemed the vessel had been set upon the strings of an instrument the ocean itself played. For a long while they drifted there, listening without sound, their hearts tightening with the weight of the sight. No mouth broke the surface, no eyes pierced the dark, yet all felt measured, contained within the patient rhythm of the bars. Then, just as quietly as they had come, the lines faded. One by one they dimmed, dissolving back into black water, until the sea lay blank again, and the ship rocked free. The sailors exhaled, the release rough in their throats. They whispered of the cage, though they admitted it had not harmed them. It had only enclosed, shown them that the sea could shape itself into walls at will. Some thought it a warning, others a demonstration. All agreed it left them smaller, as though their vessel had been reduced to a toy set upon the strings of something too vast for their minds to hold. The cage of glowing bars had shown them how easily the sea could fold itself into walls, and though it had released them unharmed, the men walked with the heaviness of those who had been contained. They feared another night of such confinement. Yet the ocean never repeats itself plainly. When it stirred again, it revealed not bars nor walls, but a presence that chose to rise in silence, so near the ship that every man felt the closeness of its breath. The night was quiet, the sails loose, the stars sharp above. Then the lanterns dimmed, not from failing oil, but from something rising beneath. The water pressed upward, lifting the hull without wave, and a pale flank brushed the vessel's side. It lingered there, close enough that the men could see lines carved deep across its surface, grooves that glowed faintly, as though carrying embers through flesh. The ship tilted with the weight of the passing, and the sailors gripped the rails, their throats dry. The body slid along the length of the hull, moving with patience. No eye appeared, no jaw opened, yet the presence was undeniable. It was not the vastness of what lay beyond sight that chilled them, but the intimacy of nearness, the certainty that they were not passing through the sea, but that the sea itself had come to brush against them, to remind them how thin the distance truly was. The wood creaked with the strain, and some men swore they felt the warmth of the glow through the planks beneath their boots. When at last the flank slipped away, the lanterns brightened again, and the ship rocked gently in ordinary waves. Yet the sailors did not move at once. They stood at the rails, staring into the black, waiting for a return. Some whispered that it had been a test, that the ocean had come so close only to show it could touch them whenever it pleased. Others said it had been a greeting, a brushing of the hull like a hand upon a shoulder, a reminder that they were never alone upon the deep. They named it simply the one who passed, not beast, not leviathan, not apparition, but presence, silent, near, unhurried. And though it had withdrawn, each man felt its closeness still, the weight of skin against timber, the reminder that the sea carried bodies large enough to graze a ship as lightly as a branch grazing a drifting leaf. The one who passed had touched them so gently that the memory of it lingered heavier than a storm. The sailors spoke of little else, their whispers hushed as though the very planks might repeat their words to the sea. Each man carried the certainty that if such a presence could brush against their vessel once, it might do so again without warning. And when the ocean stirred next, it revealed not nearness of flesh, but the haunting weight of shape too vast to fit into sight. The evening was calm, the sails steady with a soft wind. When the water ahead darkened, it was not cloud, for the stars still burned sharp overhead. The dark grew broader, stretching outward in arcs, until the ship floated upon a surface that glimmered faintly with a sheen of silver. Slowly the sheen bent into curves, vast lines that spread like the outline of wings unfurling across the sea. Each curve glowed softly, traced as though by hidden fire beneath the surface. The sailors clutched the rails, their silence deepening as the arcs grew wider. They stretched farther than the eye could follow, each bending upward before sinking again into shadow. No head appeared, no body rose, yet the form was unmistakable. It was as if the ocean itself had borrowed the image of wings, opening them across the water in silence. The ship drifted between them, small as dust in the measure of such breadth. The arcs did not strike nor fold inward. They only lingered, pulsing faintly, their glow waxing and fading as though each movement of the sea were the slow beat of a heart, vast enough to carry the horizon. The men whispered of angels drowned and risen, of guardians older than land, but their words faltered quickly, swallowed by awe. Some bowed their heads, unwilling to gaze upon the shape. Others stared wide-eyed, hearts racing, as if hoping to catch the moment when the wings might rise fully and reveal the body that carried them. That moment never came. The glow thinned, the arcs softened, and one by one the wings dissolved into ordinary waves. The sea resumed its calm, the ship pressed onward, and the sky remained unchanged. Yet no man aboard felt the same. They had seen wings without flight, form without body, and it had left them shaken. Later they spoke of it carefully, naming it only the wings. They did not claim to know whether it had been beast, apparition, or reflection. They said only that the sea had opened itself wide enough to show a form so great that it dwarfed their vessel to nothing. And though it had vanished, each man knew he would forever search the horizon for that faint silver glow, fearing and yearning for the night when the wings might open again. The wings of light had faded, leaving the ship once more to the quiet vastness. But the men carried the weight of them in their silence. For days they spoke little, each glance at the horizon, shadowed by the memory of arcs, stretching wider than sight. Yet the ocean was not finished. When it stirred again, it did not rise with wings or brush the hull in passing. It reached upward in a way that made the very surface of the world tremble. The night was still, the stars sharp, when the sea grew taut beneath the keel. The ship shuddered, lifted, then steadied as though caught upon a swell. But the swell did not break. It lengthened, rising smooth and deliberate, until the vessel sat perched high above ordinary water. From below came a glow, faint at first, then spreading like veins lit within stone. Slowly, the swell split open, and from it emerged a ridge, vast as a mountain, its skin pale, marked with grooves that pulsed like rivers of light. The ridge tilted, and the ship rolled gently across its curve. Then another ridge followed, and another, until the vessel found itself moving across a landscape of flesh. Each rise was slow, each descent measured, as though the ship were crossing the shoulders of a being too large to ever show itself whole. The sailors stood silent, gripping the rails as lantern glow danced across slopes that curved into darkness, never revealing their end. Some swore they heard a low hum vibrating through the wood beneath their boots, the sound of a world breathing below. The journey lasted for hours. The ridges rolled endlessly, carrying them forward, never halting, never turning. The men realized they were passengers upon something that had chosen not to cast them off, but to bear them gently across its breadth. When at last the ridges sank, the sea closed slowly, the glow dimming until the surface lay blank once more. The ship rocked free, sails catching faint wind, and the night resumed its ordinary silence. Later they would speak of it as the back of the world, not beast, not leviathan, but a body so vast it seemed to stretch into the shape of land itself. They said they had crossed not upon water, but upon a hidden continent alive beneath the waves, and though it had vanished into the deep, the men knew they had touched something older than stone, a presence too large for eyes to hold, yet kind enough for one long night, to carry them safely across its living spine. The back of the world had carried them as though upon a living continent, and though it vanished beneath the waves, the sailors felt as if their voyage had crossed land no chart could ever hold. Days later, the sea kept a calm, its horizon wide and bare, until one evening it showed them something stranger still. It began not with glow or shadow, but with sound, though no storm brewed and no wind stirred. A low murmur rose from beneath the hull, soft at first, like distant thunder heard through stone. The planks trembled, lanterns swayed, and every man stilled, listening. The sound deepened into rhythm, not the clash of waves, but a slow cadence, measured as the toll of a hidden bell. Then the water stirred, and from the depths came columns of faint light. They rose in pairs, steady and straight, shimmering as though built of glass filled with pale fire. The vessel drifted between them, its keel cutting gently through their glow. The columns stretched high, some brushing the surface, others leaning inward to arch over the ship, like the ribs of a vaulted roof. Their light pulsed with the same rhythm as the sound, rising and fading in perfect accord. The sailors whispered that they had entered not sea, but temple, and the cadence was its hymn. For a time they sailed through this cathedral, each column swaying as though alive, each pulse carrying weight through timber and bone. The men felt their hearts answer it, their breaths slow to match, until they moved in silence like worshippers bound by ritual. Then, as slowly as it had risen, the song diminished. The columns dimmed, their glow sinking back into the deep, and the sound faded into nothing. The sea lay plain once more, its horizon unchanged, yet none aboard were the same. They spoke of it later, as the temple, the place where the ocean had built a hall of light and voice for reasons beyond them. Some said it was not built for men at all, but for itself, to sing to its own hidden depths. Others believed the sea had opened its hymn to them, if only for a night, so they might understand that beneath its silence lived songs too vast to end. The men carried the hush of the temple with them, their voices subdued, their laughter gone quiet. Yet the ocean had not finished its unveiling. On the third night after the columns of light had sunk, the horizon grew strange. The stars blurred, though no mist lay upon the water, and the ship rocked as though the very air had thickened. Then the sea began to brighten from beneath, not in a single glow, but in hundreds of points, scattered like fireflies rising from the dark. The lights drifted upward, spreading wide until they surrounded the vessel. At first they seemed small, but as the men peered closer, they saw that each orb was immense, larger than the sails, rising just far enough to show its surface, before sliding beneath again. They were translucent, their interiors filled with swirls of pale light that shifted like breath trapped in glass. The ship floated among them, the men hushed, for it was as though they had entered a field of moons drifting just below the skin of the sea. The orbs moved in rhythm, not colliding, each pulsing softly, as though sharing a common heartbeat. Some pressed close to the hull, brushing the water beside it, with a glow that made the wood shine. Others hovered farther off, their outlines faint, but all together they formed a procession too deliberate to be chance. The sailors gripped the rails, caught between wonder and dread, for the orbs did not threaten, they only drifted, watching in silence, their glow waxing and waning like breath. For hours the vessel drifted among them. The men swore they felt their own pulses slow, their hearts matching the rhythm of the orbs. Even the lanterns seemed dim beside their light, as though the ship itself had yielded to the glow. Then, as dawn crept faint upon the horizon, the orbs began to sink. One by one they slipped into darkness, their light thinning, until only black water remained. The sailors exhaled together, released from the weight of their watch. Later they spoke of it carefully, calling it the Field of Moons, though they knew it had been no celestial sight. It was the sea showing them that beneath its skin it could raise worlds of light, vast enough to surround a ship, and make it forget the stars above. And though the orbs had vanished, the men carried away the conviction that they had not gone far. They had only drifted deeper, waiting for the night when the sea would lift them once again into view. The Field of Moons had left the sailors hushed, each man moving as though afraid to stir whatever light still lingered beneath. They carried the memory of those drifting orbs in their eyes, and some swore they could still see faint halos glowing at the edges of the waves, long after they had sunk. But the sea is restless, never content to show one shape alone. Days passed, and when it stirred again, it brought forth a vision, not of light nor orbs, but of motion vast enough to make the ship itself seem no more than driftwood caught in a tide. The night was cloudless, the stars sharp, when the keel began to tremble. The water beneath thickened, rising in a swell too broad to be mere wave. Slowly the ship lifted, carried upward, as though set upon the back of something immense. From the rail the sailors saw pale ridges break the surface, not spines nor fins, but long arcs of flesh stretching out like dunes. They rose and fell in sequence, one after another, circling the vessel in patient procession. The ridges glowed faintly, each marked with lines that curved like rivers across their breadth. Some sailors swore the lines shifted, bending as though light flowed within them. Others said they were scars, memories written in flesh. Whatever they were, the arcs moved with such quiet regularity that it seemed the sea itself had become a chest breathing beneath them. The ship rocked gently on each rise, dipped with each fall, caught in a rhythm that felt endless. The men gripped the rails, their silence deepening. No head broke the surface, no eye regarded them, yet the presence was undeniable. They were within the orbit of a body too great to reveal itself whole. The arc circled and circled, patient, deliberate, enclosing the vessel in a loop that stretched wider than horizon. For hours the pattern held, and the sailors felt themselves caught not in danger, but in the measure of something that did not hurry. At last the ridges began to sink. One by one they faded into the deep, the glow dimming, until the sea lay flat once more. The ship rocked free, sails catching the faintest wind, and the stars returned to their mirrored places on the water. The men exhaled, their chests tight with awe. Later they called it the Circling One. Not beast, not leviathan, but a presence that had wrapped them in its patient orbit, not to strike, but to remind them of scale. For it had not risen to threaten, nor to flee. It had simply surrounded, letting them drift within its vast circumference before releasing them again. And in that release lay a lesson, that the ocean could hold them captive without chains, enclosing them in silence as easily as it could in storm. The Circling One had shown its patience. enclosing them without strike or roar, and the sailors thought the sea might grant them rest. For 2 nights the waters lay calm, the stars sharp in their mirrors, the air soft with wind. But calm at sea is never promise. It is prelude. On the 3rd night the horizon blurred, though no cloud gathered, and the ship drifted into a stillness so absolute that every man felt it settle upon his chest. The lanterns cast their glow outward, and the water caught it strangely, bending it into arcs that curved around the vessel. The arcs brightened, faint at first, then pulsing, and soon the men saw that the light was not reflection, but shape. A vast circle rose around them, wider than sight, glowing faintly with lines that wove like veins through flesh. The ship floated at its center, as though placed within the pupil of an eye too immense to comprehend. The sailors clutched the rails, their voices hushed to whispers. Some swore they felt the circle contract, tightening as though to measure them. Others said it breathed, expanding and narrowing with the rhythm of a chest. Whatever it was, its presence pressed upon them heavier than any storm. They were not attacked, not even threatened, only held, contained within the gaze of something that had chosen to look upon them. For long minutes the circle glowed, its faint veins brightening, dimming, brightening again. The men stood frozen, hearts beating hard against the silence, until at last the glow began to fade. Slowly the arcs unraveled, the circle widened, and then it slipped back into the deep. The sea lay plain again, its mirror unbroken, the horizon steady as if nothing had passed. Yet none aboard could forget what they had seen. They named it the Eye, though each man admitted the word was too small. It was not the eye of beast, nor Leviathan, but of the sea itself, lifted from the dark to remind them they were never unseen. And though it had vanished, each sailor felt the same truth pressed deep into his chest. The ocean watched, always, and when it chose to open its gaze, men were powerless, but to drift within it until it closed again. The eye of the sea had released them, and though it left no wound nor mark, the memory of being held within its gaze pressed on the men like a weight too vast to set down. They moved carefully, as if their steps upon the deck might echo into the dark beneath. The days that followed brought calm skies and steady winds, yet calm no longer soothed them, for they had learned that the sea's silence was never empty, and when the ocean stirred again, it did not come as light, nor shadow, nor breath, but as a rising of shapes too deliberate to be called waves. It began with ripples, faint and long, spreading outward from the bow. The sailors leaned over, expecting nothing more than tide against timber, but the ripples gathered into lines. They ran parallel, straight and unbroken, as though drawn by hand across the surface. Then the lines bent, curving inward, until they formed a spiral that circled the vessel. The ship rocked gently at its center, sails slack though no wind had faltered. The spiral widened, and with it rose pale ridges from the deep. They were not jagged, not violent, but smooth arcs of flesh, glimmering faintly as they surfaced one after another. The sailors clutched the rails, their silence deepening as they realized they were enclosed within the coil of something immense. The arcs moved with calm precision, rising and falling in rhythm, each one carrying a glow that waxed and waned like breath. For hours the spiral held, the vessel drifted within it, carried as though upon the palm of a hand. Some sailors bowed their heads, others stared wide-eyed, but none dared to break the hush. It was not hunger that encircled them, nor threat, but patience, patience fast enough to remind them they were small. At last the arcs began to sink, the spiral loosening until it uncoiled entirely. The ridges faded, the glow vanished, and the ship rocked free once more. They spoke of it later as the spiral one. Not beast, not Leviathan, but presence, a body too great to show itself whole, choosing instead to surround them in a circle that spoke of endlessness. And though it had vanished, the sailors carried the certainty that it had not gone far. It had only sunk deeper, coiled again in silence, waiting for the night when the sea would choose once more to draw its circles around those who dared to cross its face. The spiral one had loosed its coil and vanished, yet the men felt the echo of its rhythm in their bones, as though the sea had left its pattern pressed upon their hearts. They moved with caution in the days that followed, wary not of storms but of silence. For it was silence that so often heralded the ocean's unveiling, and so it was again. The night lay cloudless, the stars burning in countless sharp points, when the water beneath began to smooth. Lantern lights stretched unbroken across the surface, and then stopped, cut short by something rising below. At first it seemed a shadow, vast and round, blotting the reflection, but soon it gathered into shape, broad discs, rising in sequence, glimmering faintly as though traced with hidden light. They came one after another, each larger than the deck itself, each moving with patient precision. The discs layered upon one another, building upward, until the ship floated among them, like a mote caught within the rings of a colossal wheel. The sailors gripped the rails, their silence absolute, for the discs did not drift as waves. They turned, slowly, deliberately, each one revolving with a rhythm that shook the timbers beneath their boots. For hours the wheel turned. The men swore they felt the vessel carried, not by tide, but by a motion vast enough to bend time itself. Some whispered that they had been taken into the heart of a clock the sea had kept since the first dawn, its hands hidden in the dark. Others said it was no clock but a body, vast and alive, showing its hidden anatomy. Whatever the truth, none doubted they were enclosed within a structure more immense than any mountain. At last the discs began to sink. The wheel loosened, its rings dissolving one by one into the deep. The glow faded, the motion stilled, and the ship rocked free once more. Yet the silence that followed weighed heavier than the vision itself. The men exhaled slowly, as though reluctant to break the memory of being turned within the sea's hidden circle. Later they called it the wheel, not beast, not apparition, but a reminder that the ocean could fold itself into forms so deliberate that they seemed like machines, moving with patience no storm could match. And though the wheel had sunk, each sailor carried the certainty that it still turned below, hidden, its circles endless, its motion unbroken, waiting for the next time the sea would raise its rings to remind them that even silence moved in rhythm. The wheel had vanished, its discs dissolving back into the dark, but the men still felt the slow turn of its rhythm in their bones. They worked in silence, their movements subdued, as though afraid that even the sound of rope and timber might call the circles to rise again. The sea granted them several days of ordinary calm, letting them believe they had passed beyond its hidden machinery. But on a night when the stars burned steady and the horizon stretched wide, it showed them something stranger still, an image drawn not of arcs or ridges, but of absence shaped into form. The ship drifted easily, sails catching a mild wind, when the water ahead grew darker than the rest. Lantern light reached into it, but the glow was swallowed before spreading, as though pressed into a depth without bottom. Slowly the dark widened, stretching across the bow, until the vessel hovered above what looked like a hole cut into the sea. The men leaned over, their breath caught, for it was not shadow, not current, but void, a disk of nothingness. So still it seemed the world itself had been erased. Then, from its edges, faint glimmers stirred. They were not bright, no more than pinpricks. Yet they moved with purpose, arranging themselves into arcs that traced the outline of a face. A vast visage took form beneath the surface, not in flesh, but in the shape of missing light. It gazed upward without eye, without mouth, its features written only in absence. The ship floated directly above it, caught within the reach of its silent regard. The sailors clutched the rails, hearts thundering, but no sound rose from below, no wave lifted them, no current pulled, only the weight of being seen pressed upon their chests. For long minutes the face lingered, its faint glimmers shifting just enough to hold its form, before unraveling into scattered sparks. The void closed, the sea smoothed, and the stars returned to their mirrors on the water. The ship rocked gently, as if nothing had disturbed it at all. The men spoke of it cautiously, calling it the face of absence. They did not agree on whether it was creature, apparition or reflection, but all felt the same truth, that the sea could shape even emptiness into form when it wished to remind men of their place. And though the face had vanished, each sailor carried the memory of its gaze, certain that somewhere beneath, the ocean still held that void, waiting to rise again and look upon another vessel lost in its dark. The face of absence had unsettled them more than any glow or ridge before it, for light could be mistaken as beauty, and ridges as simple flesh, but absence had no comfort. It was not alive in the way they understood, nor dead, but something other, and that strangeness weighed upon their minds, long after the void had sealed itself. The ship pressed onward, sails filled with steady wind, yet the men worked in near silence, their glances drawn often to the sea, wary of what shape it might choose next. The night of its return came without warning. The air was warm, the stars veiled in haze, and the sea so still it seemed to hold its breath. The lanterns burned steady, their glow spreading across the water, when a faint tremor rose through the timbers. At first the sailors thought it the groan of the hull, but then it repeated, steady, measured, like the beat of some hidden drum. With each pulse the water quivered, and from the deep rose columns of faint light. They surfaced slowly, forming a circle around the ship, tall and narrow, their glow soft as moonlight caught in glass. The columns swayed, their movement too deliberate to be tied, bending inward as though acknowledging the vessel within their ring. The sailors gripped the rails, their silence deeper than fear, for it felt less like danger than ceremony. The columns pulsed in unison, their glow brightening, dimming, brightening again, until the sea itself seemed to breathe in rhythm with their light. The ship drifted at the center of this silent ritual. Some sailors bowed their heads, certain they had entered a hall not meant for men. Others stood rigid, eyes wide, unwilling to blink. No face appeared, no sound was heard, only the patient rhythm of the columns rising and falling, marking time too vast for human measure. For long minutes, perhaps hours, the men were held within that circle, their hearts drawn into its pulse, their breaths moving with its measure. At last the glow began to fade. One by one the columns dimmed, sinking back into the dark, until the ship lay alone once more upon ordinary sea. The night resumed its silence, the stars faint behind haze, and the men exhaled together, as if released from a weight upon their chests. Later they spoke of it as the ring, though some whispered it was not a ring at all, but the ribs of a body vast enough to enclose the world. Whatever its truth, they knew they had been contained within its patience, not harmed, not tested, but held. And that memory stayed with them more than any storm, for storms pass quickly, but the knowledge of being enclosed by silence does not. The ring had faded, its columns sinking into blackness, as though they had never been, yet the silence it left pressed heavier than storm. The sailors moved softly upon the deck, their eyes drawn often to the rails, for they knew now the ocean could raise walls at will, and enclose them without sound or warning. Days passed in uneasy calm, and the men began to wonder whether the sea had chosen to rest. But the ocean does not sleep. On the seventh night it revealed itself again, not as glow or absence, but as movement so immense that the world itself seemed to bend. The keel trembled first, a low vibration that ran the length of the vessel. The timbers groaned, the lanterns swayed, and the sailors froze where they stood. Then the water ahead lifted, not in wave, but in a long curve that arched high, smooth and unbroken, like the back of a buried mountain, rising from the deep. More curves followed, one after another, spreading outward, until the ship rode at the center of a living procession. Each ridge glimmered faintly, traced with veins of pale light that rippled as they moved. Some sailors swore they saw shapes upon them, spirals, lattices, lines like writing etched into flesh, though others said it was only the trick of glow against water. Whatever they were, the ridges rolled in rhythm, carrying the vessel upon their breathless undulation. No storm struck, no current dragged. It was not chaos but order, a motion so steady that even the men's hearts seemed to fall into its measure. The ship drifted within it for hours. The arcs rose and fell, circling slowly, patient as the turn of seasons. Some sailors bowed their heads, others gripped the rails until their knuckles whitened, but none dared to break the hush. It was not threat that held them, nor mercy, but presence, the certainty that they were riding upon the back of something too vast to show itself whole. When at last the ridges sank, the sea smoothed, the glow dimmed, and the vessel rocked free once more, The night returned to calm, stars burning steady above, as though nothing had happened at all. Yet none aboard believed it. They whispered of the procession, a body too great to rise all at once, showing itself only in parts, enough to remind them that they had not crossed empty water, but the shoulders of a being vast enough to bear them without notice. And though it had gone, each man carried the knowledge that they might at any moment feel its ridges lift beneath them again, the sea folding into motion that made them passengers upon a back without end. The procession of ridges had carried them as though upon the shoulders of something too vast to name, and even after it vanished, the sailors moved as if their ship were still cradled upon its back. They whispered little, their silence stretched taut, for they knew the sea revealed only what it wished, when it wished, and so when the next vision came, it was not as glow nor as motion, but as stillness shaped into form so deliberate that even the stars above seemed to bow. The night was calm, the horizon wide and unbroken, when the water smoothed into a mirror. Every star burned sharp upon its surface, a perfect reflection. The sailors found comfort in the symmetry, until the mirrored constellations began to bend. Slowly, carefully, the reflections drew inward, pulled toward a center just beneath the keel. Lines curved, spirals stretched, and soon the ship floated not upon a sea of stars, but within the eye of a vortex made of heaven's own light. The sailors gripped the rails, their voices caught in their throats. The stars did not scatter, they arranged themselves, one constellation folded into another, arcs knitting together until the reflection formed a face vast enough to span the horizon. It gazed upward, its features drawn not by shadow nor glow, but by the shifting of the mirrored sky. No sound came, no wave stirred, yet every man felt its attention press upon him, as though the stars themselves had become eyes. The face lingered, patient, unblinking. Some sailors bowed, others stared wide-eyed, unable to turn away. The weight of being looked upon filled the air heavier than storm, until the men's breaths came shallow and strained, and then just as slowly, the reflection loosened. The constellations slid back to their places, the vortex dissolved, and the sea became mirror once more, its surface unbroken. The night resumed as though nothing had stirred, yet none aboard were fooled. Later they spoke of it as the sky mask, the night when the heavens bent into a visage the sea had chosen to wear. They did not call it beast, nor apparition, but presence, silent, immense and patient. And though it had gone, each man carried the knowledge that the sea could, at any time, borrow the stars themselves to gaze back, leaving no horizon untouched by its watching eyes. The sky mask had unsettled them, in ways no ridge nor glow had managed, for it had taken what was familiar, the stars themselves, and bent them into a face too vast to deny. Even after the constellations had returned to order, the sailors looked upward with unease, fearing the heavens might fold again at any moment. Days passed in uneasy calm, and then the ocean stirred once more, not with borrowed stars, but with light of its own. It began as a faint shimmer beneath the keel, pale and soft, as if a lantern had been lowered into the deep. The sailors leaned over, their breaths held, as the glow widened into circles, one ring at first, then another still, until the vessel floated at the heart of a field of light. The rings pulsed gently, their edges sharp, their centers dark, each one widening slowly, until they overlapped in patterns too perfect to be chance. The ship drifted through them as though caught upon a map drawn by unseen hands. The rings spread outward, some large enough to touch the horizon, others small as the deck itself. Each pulsed in rhythm, brightening and dimming together, their glow mirrored faintly in the faces of the men who watched. Some sailors whispered that they were eyes, vast and silent, watching from below. Others said they were breaths, rising to the surface to mark the ocean's hidden pulse. For hours the field held. The ship rocked gently, cradled by rings that widened and faded again, never breaking, never rushing. The men stood transfixed, unwilling to look away, for it seemed they had been drawn into a ritual not their own. Then, as dawn pressed faint light upon the horizon, the rings began to dissolve. One by one they dimmed, their edges thinning, until only black water remained. The men exhaled together, their relief edged with unease. Later they spoke of it as the Field of Rings, though they admitted the name was too simple. They said the sea had written upon itself, carving circles of light across its skin, to remind them that its language was endless. And though the rings had vanished, each sailor carried the certainty that they were not gone. They waited in silence beneath, patient, ready to rise again, when the ocean wished to remind men that every calm surface hides a script too vast to read. The Field of Rings had vanished, leaving the sea smooth once more. Yet the men could not shake the memory of drifting within circles too vast to measure. They whispered of it cautiously, unwilling to raise their voices, as if the water might overhear and draw the rings again. But the sea is patient, and when it chose to reveal itself next, it did so with a form stranger than any yet seen, an image neither of flesh nor of glow, but of silence pressed into shape. The night was calm, the stars faint behind a veil of haze, when the ship slowed. No wind stirred, no tide pressed, yet the vessel faltered, as though caught upon invisible ground. Lanterns burned steady, their light reaching only a short distance before being swallowed by dark. Then, beneath the bow, the sea opened, not with splash nor wave, but with stillness so absolute it seemed. The world itself had ceased to breathe. From that stillness, shapes began to rise. They were tall and narrow, pale against the black, each bending as though lifted from a spine buried deep below. More followed, forming a corridor that arched overhead. The ship drifted into it without sound, its timbers groaning softly as if in recognition. The arches pulsed faintly, not with light, but with rhythm, a vibration so low it seemed to move through bone more than ear. The sailors clutched the rails, their silence deeper than fear, for they knew they had entered a chamber not meant for men. For long minutes, perhaps hours, the vessel floated through that living hall. Some bowed their heads, others stared unblinking, but none dared to speak. It was not hunger that pressed upon them, nor malice, but the sheer certainty of scale, a reminder that their ship was no more than dust drifting within a body that had chosen to form itself into walls. At last the arches sank, one by one, their pale forms dissolving into the deep. The rhythm faded, the silence lifted, and the sea returned to calm. The lanterns burned brighter, their glow spreading once more, and the sails filled with a faint wind. Yet the men did not rejoice. They stood at their posts long after, their breaths shallow, their eyes fixed on the water, knowing they had been carried through a space that did not belong to them. Later they called it the Hall of Silence, not beast, not leviathan, but presence, the sea folding itself into a cathedral vast enough to remind them that its depths were more than void. And though it had vanished, the sailors carried away the conviction that it had not dissolved entirely. It had only closed its doors, waiting for another night when the ocean would choose to raise its arches again, and remind men of how small they truly were. The Hall of Silence had pressed upon them like no storm ever could, its arches rising and folding them into a chamber not meant for men. Even after it vanished, the memory lingered heavy as ballast. The sailors moved lightly about the deck, unwilling to break the hush that seemed to follow them. For a time the sea remained still, carrying them onward beneath a sky sharp with stars. But the ocean does not forget, and when it stirred again, it did so with a vision that blurred the line between surface and sky. It began with the water brightening in patches, faint glows rising here and there like scattered embers. The men leaned over, lanterns in hand, as the glows grew and spread, linking together into lines. Those lines curved inward, connecting until the vessel drifted upon the edge of a circle vast enough to stretch to the horizon. More circles followed, overlapping, weaving into patterns so broad that the ship seemed caught in the heart of a living script. The circles pulsed gently, their light waxing and fading as though in conversation. No sound carried, yet the men felt the rhythm in their chests, their hearts answering as if drawn into a hidden measure. Some whispered of language written in light, others of eyes rising to watch, but all agreed they had entered into a pattern not born of chance. The sea was speaking, though no man aboard could read its script. For hours the ship drifted within the field. The circles widened and contracted, layered upon one another until the water itself seemed woven. Then slowly, the glows thinned, the circles unraveled, fading one by one, until only black water remained. The lanterns regained their reach, the stars returned to their mirrored places, and the ship rocked gently in ordinary silence. Later they spoke of it as the sea's script, not beast, not apparition, but a language older than tide, written across the skin of the water for reasons beyond men's understanding. Some swore it had been meant for them, others that they had only drifted across a page the sea had turned for itself. Whatever the truth, the sailors carried away the knowledge that the ocean held more than bodies in its dark. It held words vast and fleeting, drawn in light across its surface before vanishing back into silence. The sea's script had left them restless. Even those who swore they could not read its circles found themselves haunted by the rhythm of its glow, their dreams filled with patterns widening and closing, like the turning of unseen pages. Days passed, and though the waves lapped gently and the sky stretched clear, the men no longer trusted calm. They knew the ocean could, at any moment, pull its language across the surface again, and soon it did, but not in circles. On a night when the stars burned faint and the moon was veiled, the water began to ripple in lines. At first they seemed no more than the ordinary play of current, but then they sharpened, straight as cords pulled taut. Dozens of them rose, glimmering faintly, as though filled with hidden fire, until the vessel floated upon a lattice too precise to be chance. The lines ran parallel, crossing and recrossing, until the ship was suspended upon a grid vast as the horizon. The sailors clutched the rails, their silence sharpened into awe. The grid did not move like waves. It held steady, unbroken, as though the sea had turned its face into stone marked with glowing seams. Lanterns seemed dim against it, their light swallowed by the greater design. Some men whispered of nets cast by gods, others of bones rising from the deep. Whatever it was, its presence pressed upon them like weight. They were no longer upon water, but upon a structure, alive beneath them. The vessel drifted slowly across the lattice, its keel humming faintly, as if in answer. The lines pulsed in rhythm, one after another, spreading outward in waves of light. For hours the grid held, endless, perfect, unyielding. The sailors could not measure its reach, for every horizon revealed only more of the same. Lines crossing, recrossing, stretching without flaw. At last the glow began to dim. The grid unraveled, fading into ripples, until the sea lay blank again. The ship rocked free, its timbers sighing, as though relieved of a burden, and the stars regained their mirrors upon the water. The men breathed easier, though none laughed, for the memory of the lattice was too heavy for jest. Later they named it the net of the sea, not beast, not leviathan, but design, proof that the ocean could draw not only circles, but structures, vast and unbreakable, upon its skin. And though it had sunk, each man carried the certainty that the grid was not gone. It lay beneath, endless, waiting, its glowing seams ready to rise, whenever the ocean wished to remind them that they sailed not on chance, but on patterns too broad for human sight. The net of the sea had unsettled them in ways few visions had before. Circles they could imagine as eyes, ridges as bodies, but a grid, so vast, so perfect, spoke of purpose. It made the men feel not merely small, but measured, as though they had been pinned upon a chart, drawn by the ocean itself. Even after the glow had sunk and the water smoothed, they carried the unease of being mapped, and when the sea revealed its next shape, it was not lines nor circles, but something stranger still, forms that rose like memories out of the deep. The night was clouded, the stars dim, when the surface began to shift. At first it was nothing more than ripples, but then the ripples gathered into shapes, arches, towers, walls, rising pale against the dark. They were not solid, not flesh, but outlines, traced faintly with light, as though the sea were sketching buildings upon its own skin. The ship drifted between them, its timbers groaning, as though it had entered a drowned city rebuilt in silence. The sailors stared wide-eyed. Some swore they recognized streets, rows of glowing arches that curved overhead like bridges. Others whispered of temples, their pillars tall and steady, etched with lines too intricate for chance. The vessel glided slowly through them, carried not by wind, but by the stillness of water holding its breath. Lanterns flickered, their glow dim beside the pale outlines rising on every side. No sound came, no voice broke the hush. Yet the sailors felt as though they had intruded upon a place meant for neither living nor dead. Some bowed their heads, whispering prayers, others stared unblinking, unwilling to look away. For long minutes, perhaps hours, the ship drifted through the glowing ruins. Then, as quietly as they had risen, the shapes began to dissolve. Towers melted back into waves, arches fell into ripples, and soon nothing remained but black water stretching empty to the horizon. The men stood silent, their breaths shallow, their hands trembling on the rails. Later they called it the drowned city, though they admitted it had not been a city in truth. It had been memory, drawn upon the sea for a night, a shape of structures long vanished, or perhaps never built at all. And though it had gone, the sailors carried with them the weight of having walked, if only in drifting silence, through the ghost of a place the ocean had chosen to remember. The drowned city faded, its arches and towers sinking back into dark water, as though they had been no more than dreams. Yet the sailors did not forget. They moved about the deck in silence, as if fearful their steps might echo against walls no longer there. Some whispered that the sea had shown them ruins buried in its depths, others that it had built the shapes itself from memory too old for men to share. Whatever the truth, all carried the weight of having drifted through a place not meant for their eyes. For 3 nights the ocean held steady, as if resting from its own revelations. Then, on the 4th, it stirred again. The air was warm, the horizon sharp. When the lanterns dimmed, their light bent and faltered, swallowed not by cloud, nor mist, but by something rising below. Slowly the surface bulged, smooth and pale, lifting the ship upon its curve. The sailors gripped the rails, their silence breaking into gasps, for they realized they were standing upon the chest of something alive. The swell did not break. It rose steadily, broad as the deck itself, until the vessel tilted upon its back. Faint lines glowed across the curve, pulsing in rhythm, and the men felt their own hearts falter in answer. The glow spread outward, forming arcs that stretched far into the black, as if the sea itself were inhaling. For long minutes the ship rocked upon that breath, caught in the rise and fall of a body too vast to see whole. Some sailors bowed their heads, unable to bear the weight of the rhythm. Others pressed their palms to the deck, feeling the vibration through the wood, certain that they had been folded into another being's life. No eye appeared, no jaw opened, yet the presence was undeniable. They were no longer passengers upon water, but upon flesh that had chosen, for a time, to bear them. Then, as slowly as it had risen, the swell sank, the glow dimmed, the arcs unraveled, and the water smoothed into ordinary waves. The lanterns brightened, their light steady once more, and the ship rocked free beneath the stars. The men exhaled in unison, their breaths shallow, as if only now released. Later they spoke of it as the breathing one's return, not beast, not leviathan, but life itself rising beneath their keel, reminding them that the ocean's silence was never still, and though it had gone, each man knew that the rhythm lingered, waiting in the deep, patient as the tide. For the sea had shown them once again that beneath its calm lay lungs vast enough to hold the world, and that every voyage moved not across emptiness, but across the body of something too immense to be named. So the ship drifted on, leaving behind halls of silence, fields of light, faces drawn from absence, and bodies so vast they could only be known by fragments. Each vision came and went, vanishing as quietly as it rose, yet none left the men unchanged. They had set sail upon waters they thought familiar, yet the sea had unfolded itself into forms too deliberate to dismiss, too immense to name. And though no proof remained but memory, the weight of those nights lingered. Perhaps the ocean revealed these shapes only to remind them of scale, that every voyage is small, every ship no more than a leaf carried across the breathing chest of something endless. And perhaps those shapes still wait in silence, patient, ready to rise again. For the sea never forgets. It only chooses when to show what it has always held.